Imagine a story so old it's been filed away as fiction, a tale whispered not by poets or prophets, but by thousands of clay tablets whose details are etched in stone, hinting at a truth far stranger than any fable. It begins not with the rise of kings or the carving of monuments, but with a baffling possibility that humanity was not born alone, and that our origins may be tied to visitors who came from beyond the sky. These beings, remembered in Sumerian myths as the Anunnaki, are described not as gods in the sense of divinity, but as powerful architects and rulers, figures who shaped rivers, raised cities, and perhaps even molded human life itself. They came from beyond the known stars, not as visitors, but as refugees. Their world was dying, suffocating in the cold vastness of space, and Earth, our Earth, held the key to their survival. What happened next would become the greatest story ever told, fragmented across 1,000 cultures, whispered in 1,000 languages, hidden in plain sight within the sacred texts of every civilization on the planet. Some call this a wild speculation. The ancient Sumerians called it history. Others see it as a forgotten chapter of our history, deliberately buried because it unsettles the neat order of civilization's timeline. Yet, when we follow these ancient fragments, stories of great floods, of a tower reaching for the heavens, and of cities reduced to dust by weapons of fire, the line between fable and historical record begins to blur. What remains is a haunting possibility that our past holds secrets far stranger than we dare to imagine. Before the first pyramid rose from the desert sand, before the first king sat upon a throne, before humanity even knew its own name, there were others. This is where our journey begins. Welcome to Sleep Mysteries, where hidden history meets your bedtime. Tonight we pull this story from the shelf and tell it as it was written in the quiet dust of those clay tablets. A cosmic tale of survival that began with a desperate search for gold and ended in the creation of our own species. If these stories stir your curiosity, feel free to settle in and stay with us. Remember to like and subscribe so you can return for more hidden chapters of history, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let us descend together into the depths of time where this story begins, not on Earth, but in the cold darkness of space, on a world that was slowly dying. The first images that emerge are not of the familiar Earth, but of another world adrift in the solar embrace. The ancients called it Nibiru, a planet with an orbit so vast that it stretched across a 3,600-year journey from the cold outer reaches of space into the warmth of the inner solar system, only to be flung back into darkness once more. And within this world lived the ancestors of those the Sumerians would later call the Anunnaki, beings of towering stature and pale features whose technology had conquered disease, ended war, and eliminated want. Their gleaming crystalline cities rose like monuments to scientific triumph, their architecture seamlessly blending with the sculpted landscape of their world. They had achieved what most civilizations only dream of, a society of perfect order, where science and reason governed all. Yet for all their achievements, the Anunnaki faced an enemy their technology could not defeat, the very cosmos itself. The source of their doom was written in the mathematics of celestial mechanics. Nibiru's extreme elliptical orbit, the same path that defined their existence, was slowly killing their world. Each time their planet swung out into the frozen depths of space, far from the life-giving warmth of the sun, their atmosphere grew thinner. The protective shield they had engineered over countless millennia was bleeding away into the vacuum, molecule by molecule, orbit by orbit. The great cities, once bathed in the warm light of their sun, now existed in perpetual crimson dusk. The air grew thin and sharp. Surface temperatures plummeted. The Anunnaki, a people who had mastered the atom and bent energy to their will, were forced to retreat into climate-controlled environments as their world outside became an increasingly barren, wind-swept expanse. The tablets speak of Nibiru with a reddish glow, its skies filled with volcanic ash that painted every dawn in crimson. It was not a tranquil paradise, but a world of ceaseless struggle. Continents scarred by war, mountains split by weapons of terrible force, and seas shaken by tempests born of fractured skies. At the apex of this dying civilization sat King Anu, whose lineage stretched back so far it was intertwined with the very history of his race. He was not a tyrant, but a custodian, a ruler who bore the impossible weight of watching his world fade. Year after year, orbit after orbit, his council of scientists brought him the same dire reports. The atmospheric models were irrefutable. Within a few more of their long millennia, Nibiru would become incapable of supporting life. Every solution they attempted had failed. They had tried to patch the atmospheric shield with conventional means, but the decay was accelerating beyond their ability to repair it. Their civilization, which had survived for eons, now stood at the precipice of extinction. Then came a desperate proposal, a final, audacious gamble. The scientists presented King Anu with a geoengineering project of unimaginable scope. If they could acquire vast quantities of a specific element, gold, and pulverize it into a fine monatomic dust, they could suspend it in the highest reaches of their atmosphere. This glittering shield would, in theory, reflect the meager light and heat that reached them during their long exile in the outer darkness, stabilizing their climate and sealing the atmospheric leaks. It was their last hope. But there was a critical problem. After eons of technological civilization, Nibiru's own gold reserves were almost completely exhausted. The very substance that could save them no longer existed in sufficient quantities on their world. The solution, if one existed, lay not on Nibiru, but among the stars. For generations, their automated probes had surveyed the other planets that shared their sun, and one world in particular had captured their attention, a small, vibrant planet that their trajectory would carry them past as they swung through the inner solar system, the seventh planet in their count from the outer darkness. They called it Kai, the Foundation, but we know it by another name, Earth. The probes had sent back data that seemed almost too good to be true. This world was not only teeming with life, rich in liquid water and blessed with a stable atmosphere, it was also abundant in the very element they so desperately needed. Gold deposits lay scattered across its continents, waiting to be extracted, but mounting a mission across such a vast distance would require resources they could ill afford. It would demand a new generation of spacecraft, a commitment of their remaining energy reserves, and a crew willing to travel to a primitive, volatile world whose very environment might prove hostile to their physiology. In King Anu's High Council chamber, where the fate of their civilization would be decided, two figures stood in stark opposition. These were Anu's sons, and the fundamental conflict between them would shape not only the mission to Earth, but the destiny of an entirely new species. The first was Enlil, the commander, disciplined, authoritative, and pragmatic to his core. He was the heir apparent, a being who saw the universe in terms of order, law, and logistics. To him, the mission to Earth was fundamentally a mining operation, a problem to be solved with efficiency and control. Resources needed to be extracted, processed, and shipped home. Nothing more, nothing less. His younger half-brother was Enki, whose name meant Lord of Earth, a prophetic title, as it would turn out. Enki was a master scientist, a geneticist, and engineer of unparalleled genius. But unlike his brother, he was driven by boundless curiosity that often chafed against Enlil's rigid authority. Where Enlil saw resources to be extracted, Enki saw a world of wonders to be studied, a unique biological experiment he yearned to understand. The tension between them was more than sibling rivalry. It was a fundamental clash of philosophies: control versus curiosity, order versus creation, duty versus compassion. King Anu, in his weary wisdom, saw the strengths and dangers in both of his sons. The decision fell, as it had to. A mission would be launched. The survival of Nibiru depended on it. But the question of leadership and what their true purpose would be once they reached that distant blue world hung heavy in the throne room, pregnant with the fate of two worlds. After heated debate, Anu brokered a fragile compromise. Enki would lead the first expedition, the landing party. He would be the man on the ground, establishing the base and beginning the preliminary operations. But Enlil would retain ultimate command, reviewing his brother's progress from Nibiru and issuing the final orders. It was a solution born of necessity, but it planted a seed of resentment that would grow into a power struggle of cosmic proportions. To temper his son's ambitions, Anu decreed that a third figure would join the mission: his daughter, Ninmah. She was their chief medical officer, a master of biology and genetics, a serene and brilliant mind who held a position of respect that even her warring brothers could not easily challenge. She would be the neutral party, the caretaker of the crew's well-being and a scientific peer to Enki. With the command structure settled, preparations began in earnest. The spacecraft, which later primitive eyes would call celestial chariots, were prepared in vast hangars carved deep into Nibiru's crust. These were not crude chemical rockets, but vessels of exquisite grace, crafted from materials that shimmered and seemed to drink the faint light. They moved without sound or fury, manipulating the very fabric of space-time itself. A crew of 50 was carefully selected from among the Anunnaki, pioneers chosen for their courage, scientific expertise, and psychological resilience. They were leaving behind everything they knew for the unknown glare of a younger, more vigorous star. Into the heart of the main vessel, Enki placed the ME, the Tablets of Destiny. These were not stone tablets, but shimmering crystalline data storage devices of unimaginable capacity, containing the sum of Nibiru's knowledge: star charts, engineering schematics, biological encyclopedias, and the precise coded instructions for their mission. They were the soul of Nibiru's science, a portable library of a dying world. The departure was a solemn affair. There were no cheering crowds, no grand parades. Their situation was too dire for celebration. As Enki's ship ascended, he watched his world fall away below. From space, Nibiru was a majestic sight, a vast orb of deep crimson and swirling violet. But even from this distance, he could see the telltale thinness of its atmospheric shroud, a fragile veil clinging desperately to a dying world. As they moved out into the system, the planet shrank to a crescent, then to a star, then to a fading red ember in the infinite black. The weight of his purpose settled upon Enki, a cold, heavy certainty. He was the custodian of that ember's final hope. The journey across the solar system was measured not in days or months, but in years. To endure it, the 50 pioneers were sealed into chambers of deep stasis, not a dreamless sleep, but a slow, drifting state of consciousness where time became elastic and thoughts flowed like deep ocean currents. Enki, suspended in the cool, humming darkness, dreamt. He dreamt of the data his probes had sent back, but now it was alive. He saw churning oceans of impossible blue, continents of vibrant green, and clouds of brilliant white, all under the fierce, life-giving light of a sun that shone with a yellow-white intensity he could barely imagine. He dreamt of the very thing his world had lost, a raw, untamed, profligate abundance of life. The ship navigated the cosmos with quiet intelligence, dodging the tumbling debris of the asteroid belt, which the ancient texts would later call the hammered bracelet, weathering solar storms and navigating the immense gravitational wells of the outer gas giants. Then, after a passage of time that had lost all meaning, a soft chime echoed through the silent corridors, pulling the crew from their long slumber. The stasis fields disengaged, and one by one, the 50 pioneers awoke. Enki was the first on his feet, drawn by an irresistible pull to the main viewport. And there it was, not a data point, not a dream, but a real living world hanging in the velvet blackness. Earth. It was more beautiful and more terrifying than he had ever imagined. The sheer vitality of it was an almost physical blow, the untamed energy rolling off it in waves. The colors were so saturated, so intense, a stark and shocking contrast to the muted, solemn tones of Nibiru. He saw the fury of storms churning in the atmosphere, the glint of sunlight on vast, unbroken oceans, and the deep, verdant blanket of life that covered its lands. Enki was a scientist, a being of logic and data, but in that moment, he felt a surge of pure, unadulterated awe. He had come to this world as a miner, a savior for his own people. But as he stared at this wild, magnificent, and utterly alien world, he felt the first stirrings of something different, something dangerous, the profound love of a creator for a creation not yet born. Leaving the great mothership as a silent, watchful sentinel in high orbit, Enki and his crew boarded their primary lander and began their descent. The vessel pierced the upper atmosphere like a silver needle, a sheath of incandescent plasma wrapping around its hull. Inside, there was no turbulence, only a deep, resonant hum and the gradual brightening of the cabin as they descended through thick, white layers of cloud. Through the forward screens, the surface resolved itself from a continental map into specific geography, a flat, green-brown landscape where the waters of several great rivers slowed and fanned out before surrendering themselves to a vast azure gulf. This was the land that would one day be known as Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, chosen for its access to fresh water and its gateway to the sea. The lander settled gently onto the marshy ground, its landing struts sinking slightly into the soft earth. For a moment, the crew sat in perfect silence. They had crossed the void. They had arrived. The main ramp hissed as its seals broke, lowering slowly to reveal a world that was overwhelmingly, impossibly alive. Enki stood at the threshold and stepped out into the atmosphere of Earth. The sensation was a physical shock. The air was not just air. It was a thick, soupy presence, heavy with humidity that felt like a warm, wet blanket on his skin and in his lungs. Compared to the thin, cold, sterile atmosphere of Nibiru, this was a living fluid, saturated with the smells of damp earth, of salt from the nearby gulf, and the complex, musky perfume of decaying vegetation and blooming life. It was the smell of a world locked in a constant, ferocious cycle of birth and death. The sound was a symphony of glorious chaos. 1,000,000 insects droned and chirped in a relentless chorus. Strange birds called from the dense reed beds with piercing cries. The ever-present wind whispered through the tall grasses. After the engineered quiet of their cities, it was almost overwhelming. Gravity, too, was a subtle but persistent reminder that he was a visitor in a foreign domain. It was slightly stronger than Nibiru's, and Enki felt the added effort required for every movement. And the light. The sun was a brilliant, almost violent furnace in the sky, its yellow-white glare so much more intense than the gentle crimson glow of his home world. He had to shield his sensitive eyes, the world appearing in stark contrasts of dazzling light and deep shadow. Enki took a few more steps, his metallic boots squelching softly in the rich mud. He knelt, his tall frame folding with practiced grace, and reached down with an ungloved hand. His pale fingers first touched the murky water, feeling its surprising warmth, then plunged into the cool, dark mud beneath. He brought a handful of the soil up, feeling its texture, smelling its raw, organic scent. In that moment of contact, the mission ceased to be an abstract plan. It became real, a physical communion between an ancient dying world and a young, vibrant one. Behind him, the rest of the crew disembarked, their slender, silver-clad forms appearing like apparitions against the primordial landscape. But awe was a luxury they could not long afford. The work began almost immediately. With quiet efficiency, cargo bay doors slid open and automated machinery glided down the ramp. These were not brute force tools, but sleek floating drones that fanned out, mapping the immediate area with scanners that penetrated deep into the earth. Construction units followed, humming with low-frequency energy that caused the earth to part before them, leveling the ground and compacting foundations without excavating a single clump of dirt. On a carefully selected rise, the first structure began to take shape. Prefabricated panels of lustrous white material lifted from their containers and locked into place, assembling themselves into a clean, geometric habitat. When the final panel sealed and its internal life support systems came online, it created a small, perfect bubble of Nibiru's environment on Earth. Enki gathered his weary 50. They stood before their new home, a tiny outpost of order in a vast wilderness. He raised his hand, and in the strange, heavy air of this new world, gave their settlement its name. He called it Eridu, home in the far away. It was a declaration, a comfort, and a constant, aching reminder of the red star that now seemed a universe away. If you're still here listening, leave a like so we know you're following along, and stay with me as we step into the next part of this mystery. The rebellion. Eridu was a marvel, a gleaming white city born from the primordial marsh. Its central tower pulsed with soft light, housing laboratories, communication arrays, and living quarters that perfectly replicated the serene environments of Nibiru. Enki and his 50 pioneers had created a foothold, a command center from which to conduct their great work. But as Enki's geological survey teams fanned out across the Mesopotamian plains, a frustrating reality began to set in. The gold in this region was alluvial gold, fine dust and tiny flakes washed down from mountains far to the north. It was present, yes, but scattered, difficult to extract in the vast quantities their dying world demanded. Processing it would be inefficient, a monumental effort for meager returns. Their mission required a mother lode. Enki deployed his most advanced survey drones, small, silent spheres that could map the planet's geology from atmosphere to core. They scanned the entire globe, their sensors analyzing the planet's magnetic fields and subterranean composition. The data streamed back to Eridu, forming a three-dimensional map in Enki's central command chamber. And there, far to the south across a vast ocean, a continent glowed with fierce, undeniable intensity. The drones confirmed what initial probes had only hinted at. Here, in this land of ancient sun-baked rock and sweeping savannas, were the richest and oldest gold veins on the entire planet. Thick seams of precious metal locked deep within Earth's crust. Enki designated this territory the Abzu, the deep source, the place of primeval deposits. This would be the true heart of their mining operation. Eridu would remain the command post, but the real, hard work would take place in the Abzu. The 50 members of the first landing party were scientists, engineers, and pilots, an intellectual elite. They were not suited for the grueling physical labor of a massive mining project. A message was sent across the solar system to Nibiru. The gold had been found, but the mission required workers. On Nibiru, Enlil received his brother's request with characteristic pragmatism. From a different order of Anunnaki, a younger, non-royal caste, he conscripted 300 more individuals for the mission to Earth. They were known as the Igigi. In the great celestial hierarchy of Nibiru, if Anu, Enlil, and Enki were the senior commanders, the Igigi were the astronauts, the technicians, the rank-and-file soldiers. They were not of the ruling bloodline, and their purpose was to serve the larger goals of the state. They embarked on their own long journey, not with the scientific awe of Enki's first crew, but with the grim resolve of workers dispatched to a distant, difficult post. Their arrival on Earth was starkly different. They were not welcomed into the serene laboratories of Eridu. Their ships descended directly into the harsh, dry heat of the Abzu, the land that would become their workplace, their barracks, and their prison. The operation they established was a vision of technological might imposed upon a prehistoric landscape. The Igigi used tools of immense power. Handheld instruments that emitted focused sonic vibrations could turn a cliff face of solid granite into powder. Larger machines projected beams of intense energy that lanced deep into the earth, vaporizing surrounding rock and following seams of gold. But for all its technological sophistication, the work was brutal, repetitive, and soul-destroying. The Anunnaki, even the lower-ranking Igigi, were beings of immense longevity and intellect, born into a sterile, ordered world. Here they were forced into dark, claustrophobic mines. The heat was relentless, a suffocating pressure that their advanced cooling suits struggled to mitigate. The air was a thick, choking cloud of pulverized rock dust. The darkness of the deep shafts was absolute, broken only by harsh work lamps that cast dancing shadows. And the noise, the high-pitched whine of laser cutters, the bone-jarring hum of sonic pulverizers, the constant crash of rock being moved, was maddening. It was a hell of heat, dust, and sound. And at the center of it all were the Igigi. For days that turned into years, and years that turned into centuries, their life was a grim cycle. Descend into darkness, blast rock, haul ore, ascend for brief rest, then descend again. Enki, as Lord of Earth, had overseen the establishment of the Abzu operation with perfect geometric efficiency. But his heart was not in mining. It was in studying this vibrant new world. Increasingly, he left day-to-day supervision to his lieutenants, preferring to spend time in his laboratories at Eridu, analyzing the strange flora and fauna of Earth. For the Igigi, this felt like abandonment. They were trapped in a fiery furnace while the High Command relaxed in a watery paradise. Time stretched on. A shar, one full 3,600-year orbit of Nibiru, passed. The piles of refined gold at Eridu grew into glittering mountains. Shuttles regularly ascended, carrying their precious cargo to the mothership. But down in the hot, dark, noisy pits of the Abzu, something else was growing alongside the piles of ore, a deep, simmering, and profoundly dangerous resentment. They were gods, weren't they? And yet here they were, condemned to the work of slaves. That resentment was a seed planted in fertile ground, watered by the passing of time. A Shar passed, then another, then another. 10 Shars, 36,000 Earth years. For the Igigi, whose lifespans were vast but not infinite, this was an eternity spent in deafening, dust-choked darkness. The breaking point, when it came, was not a single traumatic event, but a slow dawning realization that spread like contagion through the barracks and tunnels. A leader emerged, an Igigi named Alalu, who had once held a position of authority before being assigned to Earth. He gave voice to their shared misery. "We are of the same blood as the commanders," he would say in hushed gatherings deep underground. "Why is it that Enki can study waters and beasts in his shining city while we choke on dust? Why does Enlil sit in his high house and decree our toil, toil he himself has never known?" The whispers grew bolder. A plan formed. They would not just stop working. They would burn their tools, burn the mines, and confront their masters directly. The rebellion ignited at dawn during a shift change. As the night crew emerged from the shafts and the day crew prepared to descend, a signal was given. A single high-pitched cry that echoed across the vast mining complex. In unison, 300 Igigi dropped their energy tools. There was a moment of profound, shocked silence, the first real quiet the Abzu had known in millennia. Then the silence shattered with a roar of collective fury. The tools were picked up again, not for work, but for destruction. Laser cutters that had sliced through granite were turned on hauling machines, reducing them to molten slag. Sonic pulverizers were aimed at mine entrances, causing them to collapse in great clouds of dust. They set fire to their own barracks, a symbolic severing of all ties with their former lives. It was a catharsis of fire and violence, a furious scream against ages of toil. When the fires burned high, they formed a column, an army of rebellious gods, and began to march. Their destination, Eridu, to confront Enlil himself, who had the misfortune of being on a periodic inspection tour of Earth operations. News of the approaching mob reached Eridu long before they arrived. The 50 original scientists and engineers were thrown into alarm. Rebellion was not a concept they were equipped to handle. Enlil, awakened from his rest, was incandescent with rage. This was not just a work stoppage. It was mutiny, a direct challenge to his authority, an unforgivable breach of the order that defined their existence. As the army of Igigi arrived, they did not attack the city. Instead, they surrounded Enlil's dwelling, their numbers a threatening, silent ring of accusers. They began to chant, a low, menacing rhythm, demanding that the commander show his face. Enlil sent his trusted vizier, Nusku, to the gate. Nusku opened a small portal and called out, demanding to know who was the instigator of this madness. Alalu stepped forward from the crowd. He pointed a dust-covered finger at Enlil's house. "Every single one of us has declared war," he shouted, his voice raw with emotion. "We have put a stop to the digging. The excessive labor has killed us. Our work was too heavy, the distress too much." The crowd roared its approval. Nusku carried the message back to Enlil, who listened in disbelief. The sheer audacity was staggering, but he was also trapped. His personal guard was small, and 300 desperate Igigi were united. For all his authority, he was a king under siege. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Enlil sent out 2 urgent communications. One was a crisis message beamed to his father, King Anu, apprising him of the unthinkable mutiny. The second was an immediate summons to his brother Enki. As master of the Abzu and lord of Earth, this rebellion had begun in his domain. The two brothers were now forced into a confrontation not just with the rebelling workers, but with the catastrophic failure of their entire mission. The emergency council convened under a pall of unprecedented crisis. In Eridu's great assembly hall, Enlil stood at one end of a polished obsidian table, his face a mask of thunderous fury. Across from him sat Enki, his expression unreadable, a mixture of concern and thoughtful calculation. Beside him was their sister Ninma, her presence a calm, analytical counterpoint to Enlil's rage. Presiding over them all was the shimmering, life-sized holographic image of King Anu, transmitted with perfect fidelity across the immense gulf of space. His ancient eyes surveyed the scene, his disappointment a palpable force even at such distance. Outside the thick white walls, the low, menacing chant of 300 rebellious Igigi was a constant reminder of the mission's complete paralysis. Enlil spoke first, recounting the mutiny not as a labor dispute, but as cosmic treason. He described the destruction of valuable equipment, the cessation of gold shipments, and the intolerable insult of being besieged in his own command center. His solution was simple and brutal. Summon the main ship from the heavens. Let its weapons be brought to bear. We must make an example of the ringleader, Alalu. Let him be disintegrated before his followers. We will restore order through strength. We will force them back into the mines. He saw the problem in terms of discipline and punishment. Order had been broken and must be restored forcefully. It was Enki who answered, his voice calm and measured. And then what, brother? You vaporize their leader, terrorize the rest, and march them back into the pits at weapon point. What then? Will they work with vigor or with seething hatred in their hearts? The machines will suffer accidents, and the yields will diminish. We will spend more energy policing them than mining gold. He turned his gaze to the silent hologram of his father. The Igigi have suffered. We cannot deny it. The work is far harder than we anticipated. They are not built for this kind of relentless physical toil in a hostile environment. To use force against them is not only cruel, it is inefficient. It will not solve the fundamental problem. Anu slowly nodded. The cold logic of Enki's argument was undeniable. A resentful, enslaved workforce was a liability. The mission could not succeed under such conditions. For the first time, Enlil was speechless, his call for force blunted by his brother's irrefutable pragmatism. A heavy, desperate silence descended. They were trapped. Their civilization, which had mastered interstellar travel and could manipulate the energies of the universe, was being brought to its knees by a simple labor strike. The options seemed bleak. Abandon the mission and return to Nibiru empty-handed to await the slow death of their world, or capitulate to the Igigi's demands, shattering the command structure and inviting chaos. Into that hopeless silence, Enki's voice cut through once more, quiet but charged with a strange intensity. The Igigi are right. This is not their work to do, but the work must be done. He paused, letting the weight of the dilemma settle before offering his solution. All this time, while the gold has been our only focus, I have been conducting my own studies. In my explorations of the Abzu, long before the mines were dug, I encountered the native life of this planet. Not just plants and four-legged beasts, but another creature, a curious one. It walks upright on two legs like we do. It lives in groups. It communicates with basic sounds. It even uses primitive tools, chipped stones and sharpened branches. He could feel the council's confusion, their impatience. What did this have to do with their crisis? The creature is primitive, yes. Its mind is not like ours, but its physical form, its biological essence, it is remarkably compatible. It shares a blueprint with us. I believe it may have evolved from the same cosmic seed we did, eons ago. He looked directly at his sister Ninma, the one person who would immediately grasp the staggering implication of what he was about to say. We do not need to force the Igigi to do the work. We can create a worker, one designed for the task. The room was utterly still. Let us fashion a Lulu Amelu, a primitive worker. Let us take this existing creature, this ape man of the Abzu, and alter it. Let us mix its essence with our own. We can impose our image upon it, upgrade its design, jumpstart its evolution. We can make it intelligent enough to understand our commands, to use our tools, to take over the toil in the mines. We can create a servant race. He turned fully to Ninma. You, my sister, have the wisdom and skill. With my design and your hands, we can bring this new being into existence. We can fashion a worker in our own likeness who will bear the yoke for the Igigi. The proposal hung in the silent air, radical, blasphemous, and utterly brilliant. It was a solution that would not only save the mission, but would change the destiny of planet Earth forever. The silence following Enki's audacious proposal was profound, a pressure that seemed to fill the chamber. It was Enlil who broke it, his voice low and seething. "An abomination," he whispered, the word sharp as shattered glass. "You speak of creating a monstrosity, a hybrid beast of the field and of the heavens. It is a perversion of nature, a violation of cosmic order." He rose to his feet, his towering frame radiating indignation. "We came here to mine metal, brother, not to play God. The unforeseen consequences of such hubris are incalculable. What happens when this creature, imprinted with our intelligence, turns that intelligence against us? You propose to solve a mutiny by planting the seeds of a potential planetary war." His argument was one of passion, but also caution, a warning against meddling with forces they did not fully comprehend. Enki remained seated, calm in the face of his brother's tirade. He did not appeal to emotion, but to cold, hard reality. "What is your alternative, Enlil? To let our world perish while we stand on ceremony?" His gaze shifted to the shimmering image of his father. "The creature I propose would not be our equal. It would be a servant, its genetics carefully limited. We can build in safeguards, controls." It was this pragmatic appeal that finally swayed the king. Anu, his face etched with the worry of a leader bearing an impossible burden, saw the terrible genius in the plan. The survival of Nibiru superseded all other concerns. He gave his consent, but it was conditional and heavy with warning. "Proceed. But you will heed Enlil's caution. The creature you create must be a worker, not a rival. Ensure that it cannot procreate. We will not have our creation multiplying beyond our control, becoming a plague upon this world. Make them, but make them sterile." With the king's reluctant blessing, the great and terrible work began. Enki and Ninma established a new specialized facility, a gleaming white laboratory built in the serene landscape near Eridu. They called it the Shimti, the house where the wind of life is breathed in. It was a place of absolute sterility and advanced biological science, a temple to genetics. The first step was to acquire the raw materials. A team was dispatched to the Abzu with nets and tranquilizer darts. They returned with several female specimens of the upright walking hominid Enki had studied, creatures we might recognize as an advanced form of Homo erectus. In the Shimti, they were kept sedated and treated with strange clinical reverence. From them, Ninmah extracted the ova, the egg cells. This was the clay of the earth, the biological foundation upon which they would build. At the same time, Enki prepared the divine essence. A young, healthy Anunnaki male from the Igigi ranks volunteered, and from him, vital genetic material was drawn. It was sequenced, analyzed, and specific genes, those governing higher reasoning, language capacity, and fine motor skills, were isolated and prepared for insertion. The first attempts were catastrophic failures. In the glowing nutrient baths of the laboratory, Ninmah combined the hominid egg with Anunnaki genetic markers. Some failed to divide at all. Others began to grow, but the process was flawed, the genetic codes warring with each other rather than merging. Those embryos that reached a stage where they could be implanted into the wombs of the captured hominid females resulted in tragedy. The Sumerian texts speak of this with stark honesty. A series of monstrous births, creatures with malformed limbs, with organs in wrong places, beings born silent and still, or who survived only moments. It was a procession of horrors born from imperfect science. Ninmah was distraught, her confidence shattered by the grotesque results. She was ready to declare the project a failure. Enki refused to concede. He comforted his sister, studying the failures with a scientist's dispassionate eye. The formula is correct. The error is not in the design, but in the vessel. The hominid womb is too primitive. It cannot provide the complex nourishment required to bring our creation to term. It was then that Ninmah, in a moment of desperate inspiration and ultimate scientific sacrifice, saw the only remaining path. The vessel itself had to be of the gods. The work is my own. My hands have mixed the clay. Now I shall provide the mold. She would become the surrogate mother. Once more, she prepared the delicate fusion of hominid and Anunnaki life. But this time, after fertilization was complete and the tiny cluster of cells began to divide, she implanted the embryo within her own body. A tense period of waiting followed, every biological marker monitored with breathless anxiety. Then the time came. In the sterile, silent heart of the Shimti, Ninmah went into labor. Enki was at her side as she gave birth. The infant that emerged was perfect. It was a marvel, a seamless blend of two worlds. It had the robust build and dark, ruddy skin of the earth creatures, but the shape of its skull, the intelligence in its curious dark eyes, and the structure of its delicate five-fingered hands were unmistakably imprinted with the mark of the Anunnaki. It was the first of a new kind. Enki took the small, crying infant in his hands, a being of two bloodlines, a bridge between heaven and earth. He held it aloft in the sterile laboratory light and gave it its name. Adamu, he said, the word echoing in the quiet room. For he is of the earth's clay. The Lulu Amelu, the primitive worker, was born, and in that moment of triumph, the history of the planet was irrevocably changed. The birth of Adamu was a moment of profound triumph, but it was also just a single data point, a proof of concept. The cry of one infant in the sterile Shimti was not enough to placate 300 furious Igigi still surrounding Enlil's residence, nor was it enough to restart the stalled flow of gold to their dying home world. The miracle needed to become a production line. Ninmah, for all her divine strength, could not personally carry every new human to term. The process had to be refined and delegated. She gathered a team of 14 Anunnaki women, scientists, doctors, pilots, who bravely offered themselves as surrogates to bring the new species into being. The ancient texts would remember these as the birth goddesses who lined up in the house of life to receive the carefully prepared embryos. Using Adamu's perfected genetic template, they first created a batch of 7 males. Then, by deftly manipulating the chromosomal pairings, they designed and gestated a corresponding set of 7 females. The first of these, the female counterpart to Adamu, was a being of equal perfection. Enki gave her the name Tiamat, a name that echoed the primordial mother of their own cosmology, signifying that she would be the mother of this new lineage on Earth. In this way, a small, stable, and carefully controlled population of the first humans was born. And per the strict decree from King Anu, every single one of them was engineered to be sterile, a beautiful, perfect, but terminal generation. They were a tool, not a new branch on the tree of life. These new beings, with the minds of children and the bodies of adults, could not simply be sent into the savage environment of the prehistoric world, nor could they yet be sent to the harshness of the mines. They were a priceless, delicate creation that needed to be nurtured, studied, and trained for their ultimate purpose. A new environment had to be created, a place that was part paradise, part nursery, and part training ground. Enki chose a location in the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, not far from his city of Eridu, a wide, pleasant valley blessed with a gentle river. Here, the Anunnaki brought their technology to bear on the land itself. They dug precise irrigation canals with focused beams of energy, causing the rich alluvial soil to flourish. They planted orchards of fruit-bearing trees, some native to Earth, and others carefully grown from genetic stock brought from Nibiru. They introduced placid, domesticated animals bred for gentle temperament. Around this entire area, they erected a high, shimmering fence, not quite of matter but of pure energy, to keep wild, predatory beasts out and to keep their precious creations safely inside. They called this place the Edin, in the Sumerian tongue, the abode of the righteous ones, a place of serenity and order. To its inhabitants, it was the entire universe. It was a world of lush green gardens, of cool, clear water, of gentle animals, and of endless sun-filled days without want or fear. For these first generations of humans, life was an idyllic dream. All their needs were met by the tall, pale gods who walked among them. They were given simple, clean dwellings, and food was always plentiful. They knew nothing of hardship, hunger, pain, or death. Their Anunnaki creators were their keepers, their teachers, and the absolute masters of their reality. Enki, the scientist, took on the role of a proud, doting father. It was he who spent the most time in the Edin, walking among his creations. He saw the spark of his own intellect behind their dark, curious eyes, and it filled him with a satisfaction that went far beyond the success of a mere scientific experiment. He taught them. He gave them their first words, a simplified version of the Anunnaki language. He showed them how to use their clever hands to fashion simple tools, how to tend the gardens, how to care for the animals. These were not yet the hard labors of mining, but the gentle, rhythmic tasks of agriculture and husbandry, the foundational skills they would need to eventually become a self-sustaining workforce. Enlil, however, viewed the entire project with cold, detached suspicion. He was the stern, unforgiving god in this new pantheon. On his infrequent inspections of the Edin, he did not walk among the humans with affection. He saw them as Enki's folly, a biological time bomb. He saw their growing intelligence not as a marvel, but as a threat. He would watch them from a distance, his mind filled with calculations of risk, seeing only a tool that could one day be turned against its creator. This fundamental difference in attitude between the two brothers created a strange duality for the first humans. Enki was the source of light and knowledge, the benevolent god who gave them gifts. Enlil was the distant, thunderous authority, the god of rules and punishments, whose presence brought a chill to the air of their perfect garden. And so they lived, these first innocent children of two worlds. They grew and they learned in their perfect, isolated paradise, content in their blissful ignorance. They knew nothing of the dying red sun of Nibiru, nothing of the council's desperate gamble, and nothing of the dark, suffocating minds of the Abzu that were their sole reason for being. They were a happy, thriving, and utterly captive population, living out a beautiful, engineered lie, awaiting a destiny they could not possibly imagine. The passing of time in the lush, controlled paradise of the Eden was measured not in the long, slow showers of Nibiru, but in the gentle, repeating cycles of Earth's seasons. The first humans, this beautiful and sterile generation, learned the tasks Enki set for them with remarkable aptitude. They tended gardens, cared for animals, and maintained their simple dwellings with placid, cheerful obedience. They were the perfect biological machines, the elegant solution to the Anunnaki's labor crisis. Yet, as Enki walked among them, a profound and troubling dissatisfaction began to grow within him. He, the master scientist, saw his creation not just as a tool, but as a work of art, and he knew with an artist's painful clarity that his masterpiece was incomplete. They had intelligence, but no ambition. They had language, but no art. They had life, but no ability to pass that life on. They were a terminal species, a beautiful evolutionary dead end. His pride as their creator was at war with his duty as an Anunnaki prince. He had fulfilled his mission. He had provided a worker to take the load off the Igigi. The first batches of trained humans had already been sent to the Abzu, and their performance in the mines under Anunnaki supervision was exemplary. They worked without complaint, their robust bodies perfectly suited to toil that had broken the spirit of the gods. The gold was flowing again. The mission was a success, but Enki saw the inefficiency of it all. Creating each new worker in the laboratories of the Shimti was a slow, resource-intensive process. To truly create a sustainable workforce, to populate the mines for the long ages that would be required to save Nibiru, his new species would need to be able to replicate itself. He was caught in a dilemma: to obey the edict of his father Anu and the paranoid oversight of his brother Enlil, or to perfect his creation and, in doing so, truly solve their problem once and for all. He looked at his children, at their innocent, unquestioning eyes, and made a secret, fateful decision. He would defy the decree. He would give them their final forbidden gift. The myths of a later age would tell this story with symbols: a serpent, a tree, a tempting piece of fruit. The reality was an act of deliberate, covert genetic science. Choosing the most advanced of his creations, Adamu and Tiamat, Enki led them to a secluded grove in the heart of the Edin, away from the watchful eyes of the other Anunnaki. Here, in this quiet, sacred space, he completed his work. It was not a conversation, but a procedure. Perhaps it was a simple injection, a carefully formulated hormonal supplement, or a subtle burst of benign radiation from a handheld device. Whatever the method, the goal was to activate the dormant sequences he had deliberately left locked within their DNA, to switch on the latent biological machinery of procreation. He was, in the most literal sense, rewriting their destiny. He was opening their eyes not to some abstract concept of good and evil, but to the fundamental biological truth of their own bodies. He was giving them the knowledge of how life creates life. The change was instantaneous and profound. It was not a flash of light, but a quiet, internal dawn of consciousness. Adamu and Tiamat looked at each other, and for the first time, they truly saw each other. They were no longer just companions in a shared, placid existence. They were male and female, two halves of a biological equation. This new awareness rippled outward, transforming their perception of everything. They looked at their own hands, their own bodies, with a sudden shocking sense of individuality. They were separate, distinct beings, no longer just harmonious parts of the garden's scenery. This sudden blossoming of self-awareness brought with it a cascade of new, bewildering emotions. The ancient stories would call it shame, but it was not guilt. It was the awkward, overwhelming self-consciousness of adolescence, the realization of one's own distinct identity. And with that came the instinct to define and protect that identity. They looked at their own nakedness, which had been as natural as that of the animals around them, and suddenly felt a need for privacy, for a barrier between the self and the world. Using large leaves from the garden, they fashioned simple coverings for themselves, the first tentative act of a species that had just discovered it was separate from nature. It was this simple, profound change that Enlil noticed on his next inspection. He strode into the EDIN with his usual air of stern authority, but the atmosphere felt different. The humans, who usually greeted him with wide-eyed, placid reverence, now seemed hesitant. They averted their gaze. Their eyes held a new and knowing light that he found deeply unsettling. Then he saw it. The crude loincloths of woven leaves. It was an insignificant detail that signified a cataclysmic shift. "What is this?" he thundered, his voice echoing through the perfect garden. "Why do you cover yourselves?" Adamu, his new consciousness still struggling with the concept of deception, answered with naive honesty. "The Creator, the one who made us, he opened our eyes, and we saw that we were different." The blood drained from Enlil's face. He knew instantly what had happened. Enki, his treacherous, meddling brother, had defied a direct order from the king himself. Enlil's worst fears had been realized. He saw the future in a terrifying flash. These creatures, now able to breed uncontrollably, spreading across the planet like a weed, 1 billion biological time bombs, each with a spark of Anunnaki intelligence. His fury was absolute. His first act was not to confront his brother, but to punish the vessel of his crime. He raised his hand and pointed to the energy barrier that contained their paradise. "This experiment is over. They are flawed, contaminated." Before the shocked and terrified eyes of the first humans, he commanded the gates of the EDIN to open, and with his guard, he drove them out. They were cast out from their only home, expelled from their perfect engineered world into the vast, untamed wilderness of prehistoric Earth, left to survive on their own with nothing but the dangerous new knowledge that had cost them everything. The closing of the EDIN's shimmering gate was a silent, final act that severed the first humans from their creators and their cradle. Adamu and Tiamat stood alone in a world they did not know. The familiar, perfect garden at their backs and an endless, terrifying wilderness stretching out before them. The shock was absolute. For the first time in their existence, they felt the pang of true hunger, the bite of a cold night wind against their skin, and the primal, heart-stopping fear of a predator's cry in the deep darkness. The world outside their gilded cage operated on a brutal, simple logic of survival that was entirely alien to them. The gentle, rhythmic tasks Enki had taught them, tending plants, caring for animals, now had to be recalled and repurposed, not for pleasant, God-supervised activity, but for a desperate moment-to-moment struggle to stay alive. They found shelter in a cave, its damp, earthy smell a poor substitute for their clean, dry dwellings. They foraged for edible plants, learning through painful trial and error which fruits were nourishing and which were poison. They learned to fear the shadows, the rustle in tall grass, the glint of hungry eyes in the night. Enki, from his high tower in Eridu, watched them through his remote instruments, his heart aching with a mixture of profound pity and burgeoning pride. He had been severely reprimanded by Enlil in a furious private confrontation and was now forbidden from making direct contact with his exiled children. The command from Enlil was clear: let them fend for themselves. If they perish, it is the price of your disobedience. But a creator cannot so easily abandon his creation. In subtle, deniable ways, Enki intervened. A sudden landslide might block the path of a pursuing cave lion. A drone flying so high as to be mistaken for a bird might emit a low frequency that guided the lost and thirsty couple toward a hidden spring of fresh water. He could not bring them back to paradise, but he could, and would, nudge the scales of survival ever so slightly in their favor. And survive they did. More than that, they began to thrive, for Enki's forbidden gift was about to bear its first fruit. In the shelter of their cave, Tiamat experienced a new and frightening biological process, one that had not been part of their engineered life in the garden. Without the sterile equipment and medical knowledge of Ninmah, she gave birth to their first child. It was a painful, bloody, and terrifying affair. But the result was a miracle. A small, healthy infant, the first human being born naturally of woman on planet Earth. They named him Cain. Not long after, a second son, Abel, was born. Enki's grand transgression was now a resounding success. His creation was no longer a sterile, limited edition tool. It was a self-replicating, autonomous species, a true new branch on the tree of life. The two boys grew up in this wild world, their lives defined by the struggle for existence. They embodied the two primary paths of early civilization. Cain, following the lessons passed down from the Edin, took to the soil, becoming a farmer, learning to cultivate the native grains of Mesopotamia. Abel, adapting to the wandering herds of the plains, became a shepherd, the first domesticator of flocks. As the human family grew, slowly expanding from a single family into a small tribe, the Anunnaki began to take notice once more. The initial fury over Enki's actions had subsided into pragmatic acceptance. These creatures, now multiplying on their own, were an even more valuable resource than before. The Anunnaki re-established contact, not as gentle zookeepers in a garden, but as masters demanding tribute. They taught the growing tribe that a portion of their labor was owed to the gods in the sky. The first fruits of the harvest from Cain, the finest unblemished lamb from Abel's flock. This was the beginning of worship, an economic transaction disguised as piety. It was here that the first great human tragedy unfolded. A dispute arose over the offerings. The Anunnaki leadership, and Enlil in particular, seemed to favor the offerings of the shepherd Abel. His livestock was mobile, easily managed, a source of food for the Anunnaki garrisons. The grains of Cain, while valuable, were seasonal and stationary. This preference, this divine favor, sparked a bitter jealousy in the heart of the farmer. It was a resentment fueled by more than sibling rivalry. It was a competition for the approval and resources of the gods. The tension festered, and in a moment of uncontrollable rage over a rejected offering, Cain confronted his brother in a field and struck him down. The first act of murder, of human killing human, sent a shockwave of horror through the small mortal community and the watching immortal one. This was a consequence of self-awareness that even Enki had not fully anticipated. As punishment, and perhaps to quarantine his violent tendencies, the Anunnaki leaders marked Cain and condemned him to a life of exile, to wander as a nomad in the lands to the east. This judgment, intended as a curse, had an ironic, unforeseen effect. It became a mechanism for dispersal. Cain and his descendants carried their knowledge and their genes into new territories. Meanwhile, Adamu and Tiamat, grieving their lost son, had another child, Seth, whose lineage would continue the story of settlement. Humanity was now on the move. They followed the great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, establishing small, scattered settlements. They were multiplying, their numbers growing from a handful to hundreds, then to thousands. For the Anunnaki, this explosive, chaotic success was a source of deeply conflicting emotions. For Enki, watching from his tower, it was a source of immense, secret pride. His children were resilient, adaptable, and clever. They were surviving, and they were spreading. But for Enlil, looking down from his command post, the proliferation of mankind was a rising tide of noise and chaos. These unpredictable, emotional, and now violent creatures were spilling out across the landscape, far beyond his ability to easily control them. They were a successful experiment that had become a planet-wide pest, a source of constant, growing annoyance. The seed of humanity, once planted, grew with a wild, uncontrollable vigor that astonished and alarmed its creators. Millennia passed like seasons. The small, scattered tribes of Adamu's descendants grew into nations. They built villages of mud brick and reeds along the great rivers, and these villages grew into bustling, noisy, and chaotic cities. They learned the arts of pottery, of weaving, and most alarmingly to the Anunnaki, of organized warfare. The Anunnaki had intended to create a simple beast of burden, a biological tool to serve a single purpose. Instead, they had unleashed a force of nature, a species brimming with the same complex passions, ambitions, and flaws as themselves. For Enki, this was a source of endless fascination. He watched their progress like a proud, if concerned, father, marveling at their ingenuity and resilience. But for Enlil, the commander who prized order above all else, the proliferation of mankind was a rising, intolerable cacophony. His disgust became a visceral, palpable thing. When he would descend from the heavens in his gleaming sky chamber, he was no longer greeted by a pristine, quiet wilderness, but by a world teeming with his brother's chaotic creations. He could hear the noise of humanity rising from the earth below, not just the literal sounds of their cities, markets, and squabbles, but the psychic noise of their turbulent, unpredictable existence. They fought, they loved, they betrayed, they built, they destroyed, all with a messy, passionate energy that offended his sense of discipline. In his eyes, they had contaminated the purity of the Earth mission. They were no longer a useful tool, but a sprawling planetary infestation, a failed experiment that had spiraled dangerously out of control. He began to privately wish for a way to undo it all, to wipe the slate clean and start again, or better yet, to simply return the planet to its original, silent state. He would not have to wait long for the universe to provide him with an opportunity. Deep in the command center of Eridu and aboard the orbiting mothership, the Anunnaki astronomers and orbital mechanics were tracking a celestial event of immense significance. Their home planet, the great wanderer Nibiru, was once again making its majestic 3,600-year journey from the dark, cold depths of space into the inner solar system. For the Anunnaki, its approach was a time of renewed hope, a chance to send the vast stores of gold they had accumulated back to heal their world's atmosphere. But this particular passage, this perihelion, was different. The orbital models run on their most powerful crystalline computers showed Nibiru's trajectory, bringing it unusually close to Earth's orbital path. They would not collide, but the gravitational handshake between the two worlds would be catastrophic. The scientists on the council presented their findings to Enlil, their faces grim. The primary effect would not be earthquakes or volcanoes, but something far worse. The immense gravitational pull of the passing Nibiru would exert a tidal force on the entire planet, and its most vulnerable point was the vast, thick, and slightly unstable sheet of ice that covered the southern continent of Antarctica. The models were irrefutable. As Nibiru passed, it would pull on the ice cap, breaking its precarious grip on the continent's bedrock. A mass of ice and snow, trillions of tons in weight, would slide all at once into the southern oceans. The displacement would be unimaginable. It would not create a wave, but would cause the sea level of the entire planet to rise cataclysmically in a single surging event. A great wall of water, hundreds of feet high, would race north from the pole, moving at the speed of a skyship. It would scour the continents, wiping the lowlands clean of all life, burying cities and mountains alike. It would be a global deluge, a world-drowning event of cosmic mechanical precision. The Great Flood was not a punishment from the heavens, but a predictable, cyclical, and unavoidable side effect of their own home planet's orbit. For Enki, Ninmah, and the other scientists, the news was a horrifying portent of destruction. Their immediate priority became planning for the survival of the Anunnaki mission itself. All ground-based operations would have to be evacuated. The mines in the Abzu would be flooded and lost. Their cities, including Eridu itself, would be wiped from the face of the earth. They would have to retreat to the sky to ride out the cataclysm from the safety of their orbiting mothership. But for Enlil, the grim report was not a crisis. It was an answer to his prayers. It was a perfect, elegant, and blameless solution to his human problem. He would not have to order a single death. He would not have to fire a single weapon. The cold, indifferent mechanics of the cosmos would perform the great cleansing for him. The universe itself would erase the stain of humanity from the face of his planet. He convened the High Council of Anunnaki leadership. He laid out the chilling scientific certainty of the coming deluge. He then made his terrible proposal. They would proceed with the evacuation of all Anunnaki personnel and equipment as planned, but they would do so in secret. The decision to create the Lulu has been proven a mistake, he argued, his voice cold and final. They are unruly, they are violent, and their noise distracts from our purpose. Let the great wave wash over them. Let it be the final word on this failed experiment. He looked at each member of the council, his gaze lingering on his brother Enki. Using the full weight of his authority as mission commander, and invoking the sacred laws of Nibiru that demanded unity in the face of crisis, he forced them all to swear a binding oath of secrecy. They would save themselves and only themselves. No warning was to be given to the race of men. They were to be abandoned to their fate, left to drown in the rising tide. Enki, his heart a cold stone in his chest, was forced to take the oath, his words bitter ash in his mouth. He was now bound by a sacred promise to stand by and watch as the world of his own children was washed away. The oath, once sworn, became a prison for Enki's conscience. In the years, months, and then mere weeks leading up to Nibiru's fateful passage, the Anunnaki on Earth began their silent, orderly retreat. Under Enlil's strict command, they worked with grim efficiency, dismantling their most vital equipment from Eridu and the mining outposts in the Abzu. Shuttles ascended in a steady, silent stream, carrying personnel, data crystals, and refined gold up to the safety of the great mothership that waited like a patient star in the high heavens. All the while, down on the planet's surface, the race of men continued its vibrant, oblivious existence. They plowed their fields, built their cities, haggled in their markets, and fought their petty wars, completely unaware of the cosmic judgment racing toward them. Every day was a fresh torment for Enki. He would walk through their bustling cities in the guise of a traveler, his divine nature hidden beneath a simple cloak, and see the world he was sworn to abandon. He saw the intricate patterns a weaver worked into cloth, the focused frown of a scribe etching a story onto a clay tablet, the laughter of children playing in dusty streets. He saw life in all its messy, imperfect, and beautiful complexity. And the thought of its imminent, total annihilation was a weight that grew heavier with each passing hour. This was not just a failed experiment, as Enlil claimed. This was his family. He spent long, sleepless nights in his observatory tower, wrestling with the chains of his sworn word. To openly defy Enlil and the council was unthinkable. It would mean civil war among the gods, a schism that would shatter their mission and perhaps doom Nibiru just as surely as the lack of gold. The Anunnaki order was built on a rigid hierarchy and the sanctity of an oath. To break it would be to invite chaos that could consume them all, and yet to honor it meant being complicit in genocide of a species he had come to love. He paced the floors of his chamber, his brilliant scientific mind searching for a flaw in the logic of his trap, a loophole, a variable he had not considered. And then, in the quiet desperation of a pre-dawn watch, he found it. He replayed the moment of the oath in his memory, focusing not on its spirit, but on its precise, legalistic wording. Enlil, in his cold, commanding arrogance, had made them swear, "I shall not reveal the council's decision to any human." The prohibition was on direct communication. It did not forbid him from, say, talking to himself out loud, or from having a one-sided conversation with an inanimate object. It was a lawyer's argument, a semantic deception. But in the rigid, hyper-logical world of the Anunnaki, it was a flaw in the code he could exploit. He would not speak to a man. He would speak to a wall, and a man would just happen to be on the other side. His choice of a human collaborator was simple. It had to be a man of immense faith, intelligence, and resourcefulness, someone who would not question an incredible command from his personal god. He chose Ziusudra, the pious ruler of the city of Shuruppak, a man whose devotion to his patron deity Enki was legendary. Ziusudra was a king who governed with gentle wisdom, a man Enki had observed for many years, whom he knew to be both capable and good. Enki formulated his plan, a secret rendezvous of which only one of the participants would be fully aware. He knew that Ziusudra slept in a modest dwelling near the temple, a house constructed, as many were in the Riverlands, from tightly woven reeds plastered with clay. This simple architectural detail was to be the key to saving the world. In the deepest hour of the night, when the moon was new and the city of Shuruppak was wrapped in a profound and trusting slumber, Enki moved like a shadow. He approached Ziusudra's dwelling, a silent divine phantom in the sleeping streets. He did not knock. He did not enter. He stood outside the thin reed wall of the bedchamber where he knew the king was sleeping. Placing his mouth close to the woven reeds, he began to speak, his voice a low, urgent whisper that seemed to emanate from the very structure of the house itself. He did not address the king. he addressed the house. Reed hut, wall, oh wall, he murmured, the words echoing the cadence of ancient epic poems. Listen, reed hut, and pay heed, O wall. A decision has been made by the gods, a secret I am forbidden to share. A great flood, a deluge of immense water, will sweep over all the lands and destroy all flesh that breathes. Inside, Ziusudra was jolted from his sleep, his heart pounding. The voice of his god, Enki, was in his room, seemingly speaking from the walls around him, a dream of terrifying clarity. Enki continued, his whisper now shifting to a set of precise technical commands. Tear down your house, Ziusudra. Abandon your worldly possessions and seek only to save your life. Use the timbers to build a vessel of specific design that I will now impart. Let her dimensions be measured and exact. Build a strong roof above it and seal the entire structure inside and out with bitumen, the blackest pitch you can find. The instructions he gave were not for a simple boat. He described a cube-shaped vessel, a craft that sounded unstable but was designed to be completely sealed with no open deck. It was, in essence, a submersible, a ship designed not to sail upon the water, but to be tumbled and tossed within it, to survive the all-consuming tidal surge that was to come. And into this vessel, Enki concluded, his voice fading, you must gather your family, your craftsmen, and the seed of all living things, the essence of the beasts of the field, which I will help you to collect. With the message delivered, Enki pulled back into the shadows and vanished, his great act of loving treason complete. Ziusudra lay awake in the sudden silence. The impossible divine instructions burned into his mind. He knew with absolute certainty what he had to do. As the last echoes of Enki's divine whisper faded from the reed walls of his home, Ziusudra was left with a terror and a purpose that eclipsed all other thoughts. He did not hesitate. At the first light of dawn, he gathered his family and his most loyal craftsmen, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern as he explained the impossible task that lay before them. To the wider population of Shuruppak, who watched with growing curiosity as their king began to dismantle his own house, a different story had to be told. To announce the impending end of the world would only create a panic that would halt their work. Following the cunning advice Enki had woven into his message, Ziusudra presented a tale of personal divine disfavor. The great god Enlil, master of these lands, is wroth with me. His anger is great, and I can no longer dwell here. My master, the wise god Enki, has commanded me to build a vessel and sail south to his own domain in the Abzu, so that I may live under his protection and Enlil's wrath may be cooled. The explanation, in a world governed by the unpredictable whims of powerful sky gods, was perfectly plausible. The people of the city, saddened by the departure of their beloved king but understanding of his plight, not only accepted the story but offered their help, eager to aid his speedy and safe departure. The next 7 days were a blur of desperate, frantic construction. The sounds of sawing wood and the clang of hammered bronze filled the air from dawn till dusk, while the thick, pungent smell of melting bitumen hung over the city like a shroud. Under Ziusudra's relentless supervision, the strange, cube-like vessel took shape, its dimensions perfectly matching the bizarre but precise instructions of his god. As his craftsmen worked, Enki fulfilled the second part of his promise. Under cover of night, messengers arrived bearing a strange and precious cargo. This was not the parade of animals that a later, simpler version of the story would tell. It was a far more scientific and efficient ark. The messengers delivered a series of heavy, sealed containers of Anunnaki design. Within them, suspended in cryogenic stasis, were the building blocks of life: fertilized embryos, seed banks, and countless vials containing the carefully catalogued genetic essence, the DNA, of the creatures of Earth. Ziusudra was not being asked to be a zookeeper. He was being made the custodian of a planetary genome library, the last hope for restoring the world's biodiversity. On the seventh day, as the last layers of pitch were applied, and the great vessel was declared complete, a strange stillness fell upon the land. The winds died down, the air grew heavy and thick, and a low, almost subaudible tremor could be felt deep within the earth. The final Anunnaki shuttles, unnoticed by the preoccupied humans, made their final silent ascents, leaving the cities of Mesopotamia utterly abandoned by their creators. Ziusudra knew his time was up. He ushered his family, his wife, his sons, and their wives, and the families of his loyal craftsmen into the dark, cavernous interior of the ship. The precious genetic cargo was secured. With a heavy heart, he took one last look at the world he knew, at the city of Shurupak gleaming under a strangely leaden sky. And then, with the help of his sons, he pulled the heavy hatch shut, sealing it from the inside and plunging them into an absolute, suffocating darkness. The end did not begin with a storm. It began with a groan, a deep, resonant shudder that seemed to rise from the very core of the planet. Far to the south, the Antarctic ice shelf, tormented by Nibiru's immense gravitational pull, had broken free. A moment later, the true deluge began. From their vantage point on the orbiting mothership, the Anunnaki watched in horrified awe as a disturbance appeared on the southern pole of their planetary display screens. It was a ripple, a planetary concussion that fanned out from Antarctica. On the ground, the horizon to the south began to darken, not with storm clouds, but with a solid climbing line that blotted out the sky. It was the sea, rising as one. It moved with an unnatural, silent speed until it was upon the shorelines, and then it hit with a single deafening roar that was the sound of a world being broken. The great ship of Ziusudra was lifted violently, tossed and spun like a child's toy in a maelstrom. Inside, there was only darkness, the screams of his family lost in the unimaginable violence of churning water, the shriek of grinding rock, and the splintering of 1,000 cities. The world was being torn apart around them, and they were trapped in its heart, a tiny sealed pocket of life in an ocean of absolute death. High above, in the sterile silence of their celestial refuge, the Anunnaki gods watched their grand experiment being erased. The images on their screens were apocalyptic. The blue and green jewel that was Earth was vanishing beneath a single muddy global ocean. The carefully constructed cities, the mines, the EDIN itself, all were gone, scoured from existence. The sight was more terrible than any of them, even Enlil had imagined. These were beings of immense power and longevity, yet they were profoundly shaken. The ancient texts record their reaction with startling humanity. They did not watch with stoic detachment. They were terrified. They cowered like wet dogs in the corridors of their ship, overwhelmed by the scale of the destruction they had unleashed through their inaction. Ninmah, the great mother goddess, wept uncontrollably, her cries echoing through the ship. "How could I have commanded such evil in the council of gods?" she lamented. "My people have been laid low, and now they fill the sea like so many flies." Even Enlil, the architect of this policy, was stunned into grim, horrified silence. The roaring, chaotic waters below were a testament to his restored sense of order. But as he watched the last traces of land disappear, he was confronted with the terrible, silent truth of what he had done. he had murdered a world. For 6 days and 7 nights, the world was a symphony of chaos, and the great sealed ark was its unwilling instrument. Ziusudra and his family were tossed in the absolute darkness, their sense of time and direction lost to the violent, churning maelstrom. They were a single, fragile seed of life encased in a wooden shell, adrift on an ocean that had consumed a planet. Then, on the 7th day, a new sensation slowly dawned upon them. The violent tumbling began to subside, replaced by a gentle, rhythmic rocking. The deafening roar of the world being torn apart faded into a vast, oceanic hush. The storm had passed. The waters were calming. Ziusudra, guided by a deep, prayerful intuition, opened a small air hatch he had built into the roof. He peered out. In every direction, as far as the eye could see, there was nothing but a flat, gray, unbroken expanse of water meeting a sky of the same mournful, featureless color. The mountains were gone. The cities were gone. The world he knew had been replaced by a single, silent ocean. The ark drifted for days upon this new, placid sea. Inside, the survivors tended to the precious genetic cargo and rationed their supplies, their lives a strange limbo between a dead past and an uncertain future. Ziusudra knew he needed to find land, the first dry ground of a newborn world. Following a timeless mariner's instinct, or perhaps following a final whispered instruction from his divine guide, he decided to use the birds they had brought aboard to survey the endless water. First, he released a dove from the hatch. It flew in great, hopeful circles, but finding no branch, no perch, no sign of anything solid in the vast emptiness, it returned to the ark, exhausted. Ziusudra took it back inside. A day later, he released a swallow. It too soared across the watery expanse, its darting flight a desperate search, but it also found nothing and returned to the safety of the vessel. The hope of the survivors began to wane. Finally, after more days of patient drifting, he released a large black raven. The raven flew off, but unlike the others, it did not return. It had found something to feast upon, the floating carrion and debris from the drowned world, which meant the waters were receding and the grim evidence of the planet's death was beginning to surface. Soon after, a new sound broke the monotony of their drift, a low, scraping, grinding noise that vibrated through the hull of the great ship, a final jarring lurch, and then, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the vessel was still. It had come to rest. The ark had made landfall. With trembling hands, Ziusudra gathered his sons, and together they pushed against the great sealed hatch. It swung open with a groan, flooding the dark interior with sunlight so brilliant it was almost painful. He was the first to step out, his feet sinking into the soft, wet mud of a mountainside. He breathed his first breath of the new world's air. It was sharp, cold, and achingly clean, as if the planet itself had been washed pure. But the sight that greeted him was one of utter, heartbreaking desolation. They were perched on the slope of a colossal mountain, its peak the only thing visible above the receding waters. Below them, stretching to every horizon, was not a world of green life, but an endless brown ruin, a planetary sea of mud littered with the splintered remains of forests, the corpses of strange beasts, and the ghosts of a civilization now returned to clay. Everything was gone. Overwhelmed by a tidal wave of grief for his lost world and profound, shuddering gratitude for his survival, Ziusudra fell to his knees. He then did the only thing he knew how to do. He gave thanks. He gathered stones to build a makeshift altar, arranged kindling, and prepared a sacrifice of thanks to the God who had saved him. its sweet, roasting scent, the first human smell to rise into the clean, empty air of the post-Diluvian world. High above, the aroma, that familiar, tantalizing scent of roasting meat and sweet incense, wafted through the sterile, recycled air of the Anunnaki mothership. For the weary and hungry gods who had subsisted on tasteless rations while watching the world drown, the smell was an irresistible summons. One by one, their smaller shuttlecraft detached from the mothership and descended through the clouds, drawn to the lonely plume of smoke on the mountaintop. The ancient texts described the scene with strange, poetic honesty. The gods gathered like flies around the sacrifice, their divine hunger and relief overriding all other concerns. Enki and Ninmah were the first to greet Ziusudra, their faces filled with a profound and weary relief. But then another ship arrived, larger and more menacing. Enlil strode out, and his eyes fell upon the ark, the smoke, and the small cluster of living, breathing humans. His face, which had been a mask of grim shock, contorted into a new expression of pure fury. He had been betrayed. "How?" he roared, his voice booming across the silent mountaintop. "How did any flesh escape the destruction? Who broke our oath?" His burning gaze fell immediately upon his brother Enki, who met it without flinching. But before the confrontation could erupt into a fresh celestial war, Ninmah, the mother goddess, stepped between them. Her face was stained with tears of both sorrow and joy. She raised her hands, not in anger, but in a gesture of blessing toward Ziusudra and his family. "Enough!" she cried. "Enough destruction! Life has survived. My children have survived." The other Anunnaki, deeply chastened by the horror they had witnessed from orbit, murmured their assent. The sheer, awful finality of the flood had purged them of their anger, replacing it with a deep, collective remorse. Enlil, for the first time, found himself utterly alone. His rage was isolated and impotent against the tide of their shared guilt. He looked at the small family of shivering survivors, at the vast dead world they had inherited, and the cold fury in his heart finally broke. A great weariness settled over him. He approached Ziusudra and, in an act that stunned everyone, took the mortal man and his wife by the hands. He blessed them, granting them a special status, a promise of longevity. It was a treaty, a peace offering. A new vow was made on that muddy summit, not sworn in a council room, but born from shared trauma. They would never again seek to destroy the human race. Their task now was not to cleanse, but to nurture. On the peak of Mount Ararat, amid the ruins of a drowned world, the gods and the last man forged a fragile, uncertain promise to begin anew. The fragile pact made on the muddy peak of Mount Ararat, born from shared trauma, fundamentally and irrevocably altered the Anunnaki mission on Earth. The old world was gone, buried beneath a thick, suffocating blanket of silt and brine. Their beautiful pioneering city of Eridu, the home in the far away, was now a deep, silent memory beneath the mud. The vast mining operations in the Abzu were flooded, collapsed, and utterly lost. The strategy of direct industrial-scale resource extraction was over. A new plan was needed, a new relationship with the planet and with the handful of mortals they had, by a traitorous act of mercy, allowed to survive. In the solemn council that followed, held aboard their orbiting mother ship, the mood was starkly different from the angry, panicked debates that had preceded the flood. Enlil, no longer a furious commander demanding order, was now a pragmatic and deeply chastened leader. The sheer, awesome power of the deluge had humbled him, forcing him to confront the limits of his control. He acknowledged the failure of their old way and the undeniable resilience of his brother's creation. They would no longer treat Earth as a simple mining colony and humanity as a disposable tool. They would now embark upon a new, far more ambitious project. They would become the architects of civilization. They would raise humanity up, guide them, teach them, and in return, a grateful and prosperous mankind would serve them, providing the resources and loyalty they required in a more sophisticated and sustainable partnership. They would shift from being miners to being kings. Their first task was to establish a new operational center on the cleansed face of the planet. They needed a new spaceport, a new mission control, a new link to Nibiru. Surveying the globe from orbit, they chose a location that was geographically stable, centrally located between the great river valleys, and had survived the flood's fury largely intact. A high, arid plateau of ancient limestone. This was the Sinai Peninsula. Here they built their new post-diluvian spaceport, a facility hidden from primitive eyes. To aid in navigation for the great ships arriving from the deep, they designated a landing corridor using the twin peaks of Mount Ararat as a distant anchor point in the north. Closer to the spaceport, on the western side of the Great Nile River, they commissioned the construction of artificial mountains, massive, perfectly aligned pyramids whose shimmering capstones would serve as unmistakable landing beacons, visible even from high orbit. This region would become the new navel of the Earth, the sacred, restricted center of the gods' power. From this new hub, the Anunnaki leadership made the momentous decision to partition the habitable world into 3 distinct regions of development. They would not concentrate humanity in one place again. To do so would be to invite the same chaotic, noisy overcrowding that had so disgusted Enlil. They would divide the descendants of Ziusudra, sending each of his 3 sons and their growing families to a different great river valley to become the seed of a unique and separate civilization. The first region, the traditional heartland, was Mesopotamia, the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This territory was to remain the domain of Enlil and his clan. It would be designated the land of the Shem, the center of official Anunnaki authority on Earth. Here, civilization would be re-established according to Enlil's strict sense of order. Kingship would be lowered once more from heaven, and great cities like Kish, Uruk, and Ur would eventually rise from the mud. The second region, the long, fertile ribbon of the Nile Valley, was allocated to Enki and his lineage. This vast and ancient land, with its predictable, life-giving annual flood, was a perfect laboratory for Enki's scientific and creative mind. His eldest son, Marduk, who would later be revered there under the name Ra, was given primary dominion over this land, which would become the civilization of Egypt. Here, humanity would be taught a different set of skills: the deep mysteries of the stars, the precise arts of astronomy and stonemasonry, and a profound, complex theology focused on the cycles of death, preservation, and rebirth. The third region was the most distant of the 3, the vast plains fed by the mighty Indus River. This great land, rich in mineral and agricultural wealth, was granted to their sister Ninmah. As the great life-giver, the nurturer and geneticist, it was fitting that she would oversee a civilization that would become known for its remarkable feats of urban planning, its sophisticated trade networks, and its unique spiritual traditions. This would become the Harappan civilization of the Indus Valley, a third independent branch of the human experiment. And so the seeds of the new world were sown. The Anunnaki descended once more, bringing with them the contents of Ziusudra's genetic ark. They provided the survivors with new, hardier strains of wheat and barley, engineered to thrive in the changed post-flood climate. They gifted them the knowledge of irrigation, the secrets of the calendar, the blueprint for law, and the structure of a divinely ordered society. But in this neat, tripartite division of the earth, they also laid the foundations for millennia of rivalry and conflict. By granting each major god and his lineage their own domain, their own kingdom of mortals to command, they had simply transposed their own celestial jealousies and power struggles from Nibiru onto the fresh mud of Earth. The stage was now set for the next great act of history, one in which human civilizations would rise and fall, not always by their own hand, but according to the great and terrible game being played by their immortal masters. The New World bloomed under the careful, coordinated guidance of its immortal masters. In the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, the sun-drenched valley of the Nile, and the sprawling plains of the Indus, the descendants of Ziusudra multiplied with astonishing speed. The seeds from the Ark's genetic library yielded bountiful harvests, and the small tentative settlements grew into fortified towns, then into thriving populous cities. With this success, however, came a new and complex problem for the Anunnaki, the problem of scale. In the early days after the flood, when humanity numbered only in the hundreds, it was a simple matter for a god to walk among them, to issue commands directly, to settle disputes with a word. But now, with tens of thousands of mortals living in a dozen different cities, this kind of direct, personal governance was no longer possible. The Anunnaki were a small group of overseers, not a vast bureaucracy. Enlil, in particular, had absolutely no desire to spend his long, immortal life mediating petty human squabbles over land rights and water access. They needed a more efficient system, a command structure that would allow them to govern by proxy, to transmit their will without having to be physically present in every corner of their growing domains. The solution devised in the Anunnaki Council was a stroke of political genius that would shape the destiny of the human race for millennia to come. They would invent the concept of monarchy. They would choose one mortal man from each community, a man of exceptional ability, charisma, and loyalty, and they would elevate him above all his fellows. He would be the king. This king, however, would not rule by his own authority, nor by the consent of the people. His authority would flow directly from the heavens. He would be the chosen representative of the city's patron god, a living bridge between the mortal and divine realms. His role would be twofold, encompassing both the earthly and the celestial. On one hand, he would be the Lugal, the great man or shepherd of the people. It was his sacred duty to administer the god's laws, to ensure justice was done, to organize the great labor projects of building canals and temples, and to lead the city's army in defense. On the other hand, he was the Ensi, the high priest. He and he alone would be permitted to enter the innermost sanctum of the god's temple, to receive the divine commands, and to transmit the prayers and tribute of the people back to their celestial master. This fusion of political and religious authority into a single office, that of the priest-king, created a powerful and self-reinforcing system of control. To disobey the king was to disobey the god himself. This new political technology was first perfected in Mesopotamia, the domain of Enlil, the land where order and hierarchy were paramount. The ancient Sumerian king lists, those stark, bureaucratic records of 1,000 years of history, state with a simple, declarative certainty that, after the flood had swept over and the kingship was lowered from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. This was not a metaphor for the people of Sumer. It was a literal, historical event. The Anunnaki descended upon the newly founded city of Kish, and from among its people, they selected the man who would be the first post-Diluvian king. They summoned him to the top of the city's great ziggurat, the towering man-made mountain of brick with its stairway to the heavens, which served as the literal meeting place between the Anunnaki and their chosen intermediaries. The investiture ceremony was an awesome spectacle of divine power. The chosen man was brought before the city's patron deity. Perhaps it was Ninurta, Enlil's formidable son and chief enforcer. He was ritually bathed and anointed with sacred oils. He was then clothed in a lustrous, brilliantly colored garment, a robe befitting his new station. The god then presented him with the symbols of his divinely sanctioned office, a scepter crafted from a strange, heavy celestial metal that never tarnished, a lapis lazuli tiara that symbolized his connection to the heavens, and a ring of office that served as a seal of his authority. Finally, he was given his city's ME, not a prophetic tool, but a literal list of divine instructions, a set of laws, building plans, and production quotas that he was expected to enforce. The god would then place a hand upon the new king's head, and to the awestruck crowd gathered at the base of the ziggurat, a voice, amplified by unseen technology, would boom across the city square, declaring that this man was now their shepherd, the chosen of the gods. Kingship had quite literally descended from heaven. The covenant established on that day was simple and absolute. As long as the king and his people remained obedient, as long as they faithfully worked the fields and workshops designated as the god's property, and as long as they delivered their tribute of grain, beer, livestock, and labor to the temple storehouses, the god would, in turn, provide them with security from their enemies, wisdom to govern their lives, and the predictable blessings of bountiful harvests and overflowing canals. But if the people or their king were to falter in their duties, that divine favor would be withdrawn. The canals would run dry, the crops would fail, and the city would be left vulnerable to conquest by its rivals. This system proved incredibly effective, creating a stable and productive social order that allowed civilization to flourish at an unprecedented rate. It ensured the Anunnaki's will was done, and their needs were met without requiring their constant, meddling presence. But it also set a dangerous precedent. By linking divine favor to earthly power, it sanctified not only governance, but also conflict. Soon, the kings of various city-states, each claiming the absolute backing of their own patron god, would be encouraged to test their strength against one another, turning the fertile plains of Mesopotamia into a chessboard for the continuing rivalries of their immortal masters. The system of divine kingship worked with remarkable efficiency, and for a time, a golden age of peace and progress dawned upon the post-Diluvian world. With humanity neatly organized into productive, obedient city-states, the Anunnaki could focus on their primary mission, overseeing the slow but steady accumulation of Earth's resources needed to save Nibiru. The elder gods, Enlil, Enki, and Ninmah, governed their respective domains with a weary wisdom born from having witnessed the world's destruction and rebirth. But this fragile peace, this new, carefully constructed order, was not destined to last. It was not the creation, but the creators themselves who would shatter it. The old rivalry between the pragmatic Enlil and the ingenious Enki had not vanished. It had merely gone dormant, and its bitter seeds had been passed down to their children. A new generation of gods who had not been humbled by the great flood, and who possessed all the ambition of their fathers with none of their restraint. This younger generation, many of them born on Earth and seeing it as their rightful inheritance, began to jockey for power and prestige. In Mesopotamia, Enlil's clan held sway. His son and heir was the fierce warrior god Ninurta, a master of celestial weaponry and a staunch defender of his father's order. But the most ambitious of the Enlilite clan was his granddaughter Inanna, a goddess of dazzling, contradictory passions. Known to a later age as Ishtar, she was the goddess of both love and war, and her insatiable hunger for power, territory, and worship drove her to constantly scheme and expand her influence. In the lands of the Nile, Enki's lineage ruled. His firstborn son, Marduk, later revered in Egypt as Ra, was brilliant and proud, having inherited his father's scientific genius but not his subtle, patient temperament. Marduk nursed a deep and abiding resentment. He believed that Enlil had unjustly usurped the supreme command of the Earth mission from his father Enki, and that he, as Enki's true heir, was the rightful successor to the throne of the Earth, one who deserved to rule over all the gods and all the mortals on the planet. This clash of divine ambitions soon spilled over from the celestial council chambers onto the dusty plains of Earth, and the new system of human kingship became the perfect instrument for their proxy wars. The incessant, brutal, and well-documented conflicts between the ancient Sumerian city-states, which historians attribute to disputes over water and territory, were in reality the physical manifestation of the gods' own rivalries. The king of Lagash, who served the god Ninurta, would suddenly find a divine imperative to march against the neighboring city of Umma, whose king served a rival deity. On the battlefield, the Anunnaki's lessons in organized warfare were brought to bloody fruition. Thousands of human soldiers, their lives sworn to their king and by extension to their god, would clash in disciplined formations, a terrifying spectacle of bronze helmets, heavy shields, and piercing spears. For the most part, the gods would remain behind the scenes, content to let their human pawns bleed for their ambitions. But sometimes, when a battle was going poorly, or a strategic objective was too important to be left to chance, a patron god would make a direct and terrifying intervention. A Sumerian soldier in the heat of a desperate battle would look up and see his god's shining celestial boat descend from the heavens, hovering over the battlefield. From this craft, a weapon beyond human comprehension would be unleashed. It might be a beam of light so intense it could vaporize a section of the enemy's ranks, a wave of concussive force that threw men and chariots aside like toys, or a sound so terrible it could shatter the very stones of the enemy's city walls. To the mortal soldiers, it was a miracle, a terrifying and glorious sign of their god's favor. In truth, it was an advanced weapon of war deployed with cold, strategic calculation. The age of progress was slowly giving way to an age of divinely sanctioned holy war. The conflict eventually escalated beyond these regional squabbles in Mesopotamia. The ultimate prize, the true seat of power on Earth, was the post-Diluvian command center, the Sinai spaceport and its associated landing corridor marked by the Great Pyramids of Giza. Whoever controlled this facility controlled all contact with the home planet Nibiru. It was the key to ultimate authority. Marduk, growing ever more powerful and impatient in his Egyptian domain, decided the time had come to claim what he believed was his birthright. He made a bold play to seize control of the entire Anunnaki command structure, challenging the Enlilite authority directly. This ignited the First Great War of the Gods, a conflict later remembered in distorted Egyptian myths as the celestial battles between Horus and Set. This was no proxy war fought with human soldiers. This was a high-tech conflict fought between the gods themselves. Ninurta, champion of the Enlilites, led the defense of the spaceport. His aerial craft, described in the texts as a divine storm bird, engaged in furious dogfights with Marduk's forces in the skies above the Sinai. On the ground, Terrible energy weapons were deployed, their power scarring the very landscape and turning ancient rock to molten glass. The Giza pyramids, those serene and silent beacons, became the centerpiece of a devastating celestial war. Ultimately, Marduk's rebellion was suppressed. He was defeated, stripped of his authority, and forced into a humiliating exile. But the war had been a catastrophe for all involved. The delicate peace of the New World was shattered, and the unity of the Anunnaki was broken. Marduk, in his exile, was not repentant. His heart burned with a cold, patient hatred, and he vowed that one day he would return and claim his throne, no matter the cost. The fragile truce that concluded the Pyramid Wars was less a peace treaty and more a cold, resentful stalemate. Marduk, defeated and exiled, was a simmering volcano of ambition, his humiliation fueling a patient, calculated desire for ultimate power. While his official punishment barred him from the centers of Anunnaki authority in Egypt and the Sinai, it did not extinguish his influence. After a period spent wandering in distant lands, he made a clandestine return to Mesopotamia, the very heartland of his Enlilite rivals. He could not challenge them again with open warfare. His forces were scattered and his reputation tarnished. So he chose a new, more insidious strategy. He would not conquer humanity. He would win them to his cause. He established a new base of operations in a city that, until then, had been of minor importance, a settlement on the banks of the Euphrates River called Bab-Ilu. Here he presented himself not as a distant, demanding god, but as a champion of mankind, a divine teacher willing to share the secrets that the paranoid Enlil and his clan had kept for themselves. He promised the king and the people of Babylon knowledge, prosperity, and a direct path to the heavens. Under Marduk's charismatic and secret tutelage, the people of Babylon embarked upon the most ambitious construction project the post-Diluvian world had ever seen. They would build a ziggurat, a great temple tower, but this would be no ordinary stairway to the gods. It was to be a structure of unprecedented scale, designed to reach unto heaven. Marduk, applying his own profound knowledge of Anunnaki engineering, guided their work. He showed them new techniques for baking bricks, making them as strong as stone, and for bonding them with bitumen, making the structure resilient and waterproof. The tower, which would be called Etemenanki, the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth, rose in 7 magnificent stages, a man-made mountain dominating the flat river valley. But its purpose was far more than religious devotion. Marduk was playing a long and subtle game. The city's very name, Bab-Ilu, meant gateway of the gods. This was his literal intent. The uppermost stage of the tower was designed to be capped with a special, shimmering material, and its internal structure was aligned with the stars. The human builders in their pride declared to one another, "Let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name." In the Anunnaki tongue, the word for name and for their sky vehicles, their rockets, was the same: Shem. Marduk was secretly guiding humanity to build its own launch tower, its own Shem, a direct technological challenge to the Enlilite monopoly on space travel. News of this monumental undertaking eventually reached Enlil in his Mesopotamian capital. At first, he dismissed it as yet another act of human vanity, another king trying to outdo his rivals. But the reports from his intelligence network became more and more alarming. The scale of the tower, its unusual design, and its location in a city known to be a hotbed of pro-Marduk sentiment raised a constellation of red flags. He decided he must see this for himself. When Enlil's celestial chariot descended from the clouds and he laid his own eyes upon the Tower of Babel, his deepest fears were confirmed. He saw not just a temple, but a clear imitation of Anunnaki launch facilities. He recognized the advanced structural principles, the precise astronomical alignments. He saw his nephew's brilliant, treacherous hand in every detail. Most of all, he saw a unified humanity, all speaking one language, working as one people, using the very knowledge the gods had given them to grasp for equality. The biblical account captures his horrified realization with perfect clarity. Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. He saw a future where humans, guided by his rogue nephew, would build their own skyships, travel to other worlds, and perhaps even challenge the gods for control of the solar system. This ultimate act of hubris had to be met with an ultimate, definitive punishment. Enlil decided it was not enough to simply destroy the tower. He had to destroy the very foundation of human cooperation that had made it possible. He summoned his loyalists, and in the dead of night, they descended upon Babylon. They did not use conventional weapons that would leave rubble and craters. They used a force that was at once more subtle and more terrifying. A low, vibrational hum filled the air, and the great tower, the product of generations of labor, was shaken to its foundations, its structure collapsing in on itself in a great cloud of dust and ruin. The physical threat was neutralized, but Enlil's true masterstroke was yet to come. The root of the problem, he had decided, was unity. So unity itself had to be shattered. Fanning out across the land of Sumer, the Anunnaki deployed a technology that worked not on brick and mortar, but on the human mind. The ancient texts call it the confounding of the language. It may have been a focused sonic wave or a neurological frequency that suddenly rewired the linguistic centers of the brain. The effect was immediate and devastating. A mason would turn to his fellow worker to ask for a tool, and the words that came out were alien gibberish. A mother would call to her child, and the child would stare back in blank, fearful incomprehension. Language, the glue that held their civilization together, had dissolved overnight into 1,000 mutually unintelligible dialects. Communication collapsed into suspicion, fear, and chaos. The great unified human project was over. Unable to understand one another, the terrified and mistrustful populations abandoned their cities and began to migrate, scattering in small, linguistically isolated clans across the face of the earth. Enlil had restored his order, but he had done so by condemning humanity to an age of division and misunderstanding. The scattering of humanity after the fall of Babel's great tower achieved Enlil's primary objective. The threat of a unified, technologically ambitious human race was neutralized, but it also created a new and dangerous political landscape. With humanity fractured into a multitude of suspicious, warring tribes speaking a confusion of tongues, the world became a chaotic chessboard for the ongoing Cold War between the Anunnaki factions. Marduk, whose subversive dream of a human-built gateway to the stars had been so spectacularly ruined, was not defeated, merely displaced. He continued to move through the world as a rogue agent, a charismatic god of rebellion, gathering allies among the disenfranchised and promising knowledge to those who would pledge their loyalty to him and not the rigid, domineering Enlilites. In response, Enlil and his council knew they needed more than just a system of kingship to maintain control. They needed a loyal human army, a mobile force that could secure their most vital interests, particularly the sacred landing corridor in the lands of Canaan that led to the Sinai spaceport. They found their perfect human instrument in a man of noble Sumerian lineage from the great city of Ur, a brilliant and devout military commander named Ibru. This man, who would be known to history as Abraham, was a descendant of the high priests and possessed an unshakable faith in the authority of Enlil. He was summoned, tested, and chosen by the Anunnaki leadership for a crucial mission. He was to take his family, his retinue, and his elite corps of soldiers and migrate to the lands of Canaan. There he would act as the Enlilites' trusted human general, a mobile force to patrol the borders of their sacred territory, to keep the trade routes open, and to quell any rebellion stirred up among the local tribes by Marduk's agents. Abraham accepted the divine command without question, beginning the great journey that would set the stage for the next terrible chapter in the War of the Gods. While Abraham was establishing his presence in Canaan, Marduk was busy building a new and formidable power base. He had found fertile ground for his revolutionary message among the rich and decadent city-states of the Jordan Valley, nestled in the deep geological rift that held the Dead Sea. 5 of these cities, including the powerful twin capitals of Sodom and Gomorrah, grew wealthy from mining the region's abundant bitumen and from their control of key trade routes. Influenced by Marduk's promises of even greater wealth and power, they renounced their fealty to Enlil and secretly pledged themselves to the rogue god. But this was more than a simple political rebellion. Enlil's spies soon brought him news that was far more alarming. Under Marduk's guidance, the people of Sodom were using their technical skills to construct a new, clandestine space facility at the southern end of the Dead Sea, a hidden port from which Marduk could launch his own craft and once again challenge the Enlilite monopoly on celestial travel. The news that a second Babel was being attempted, this time in secret and on the very doorstep of their primary spaceport, sent the Anunnaki Council into a state of high alert. A direct military assault like the Pyramid Wars was deemed too risky and too costly. It could escalate into a full-blown civil war that would devastate the planet. They needed a different solution, a surgical strike of such overwhelming and terrifying power that it would not only eliminate the immediate threat, but would also serve as a permanent, unforgettable warning to any other humans who might consider siding with Marduk. After a grim and momentous debate, the decision was made. They would authorize the use of their most feared and seldom used armaments, the 7 weapons of terror. The ancient texts describe them with names like the one whose impact spreads and the one that turns the sky to darkness. These were tactical nuclear devices. Enlil's son, the warrior Ninurta, and Nergal, a son of Enki, who had sided fiercely with the Enlilites against his own rebellious brother, were chosen to command the terrible mission. Even in this moment of cold strategic calculation, a flicker of something resembling mercy was shown. Abraham's nephew, Lot, had settled in the city of Sodom, and the Anunnaki had no wish to harm the kin of their most loyal human servant. So 2 of their intelligence agents were dispatched to the city, arriving in the guise of simple travelers. These were the angels of the biblical account. They located Lot, warned him of the impending total destruction of the city, and commanded him to gather his family and flee into the mountains without delay. They gave him one final, chilling instruction. When the destruction begins, do not stop, do not hesitate, and under no circumstances are you to look back. At dawn the next day, as Lot and his family were scrambling up the rocky hillsides, a lone Anunnaki flyer appeared high in the sky over the placid, shimmering waters of the Dead Sea. From its belly, a single object was released. There was no sound, only a flash of light so brilliant it was like a new sun being born in the heart of the valley, a light that bleached all color from the world. A moment later, A wave of unbearable heat rolled across the landscape, and a deafening roar finally shattered the morning silence. A great, terrifying cloud, a pillar of smoke and fire, rose into the sky, churning and boiling, its shape like a monstrous blooming flower. The 5 cities of the plain, Sodom, Gomorrah, and their neighbors, were instantly and utterly vaporized. The waters of the sea itself boiled, and the very ground was superheated into a glassy, crystalline crust. Lot's wife, overcome by fatal curiosity or grief for her lost home, ignored the command. She turned to look back into the heart of the incandescent blast, and in that instant, she was turned into a pillar of salt, a poetic and chillingly accurate description of a body being instantly desiccated and flash fossilized by an intense thermonuclear explosion. From his vantage point many miles away in the hills near Hebron, Abraham saw the column of smoke rising from the valley as the smoke of a great furnace. Marduk's power base was annihilated. His secret spaceport was a radioactive crater, but a terrible new precedent had been set, and a deadly evil wind was now beginning to blow from the smoldering ruins. The mushroom cloud that rose over the Dead Sea Valley was a terrible, smoldering tombstone for Marduk's ambitions. In the High Council of the Anunnaki, the mission commanders, Ninurta and Nergal, reported their success with grim finality. The 5 rebellious cities were gone. The clandestine spaceport was a crater of molten glass. The immediate threat to the Sinai corridor was neutralized. It was a victory, swift and absolute, achieved with a terrifying surgical precision that had avoided the costly and protracted battles of the Pyramid Wars. Yet the atmosphere in the council was not one of celebration. A profound unease lingered. They had unleashed their ultimate weapons, the final sanction, a power drawn from the very heart of the atom, which they had sworn to use only in the most dire of circumstances. Enki, his face a mask of grief, was appalled. He mourned not only for the vaporized cities and the thousands of human lives extinguished in an instant, but for the fundamental law of nature that his kin had so casually and arrogantly broken. He knew that such immense power, once unleashed upon the fabric of a world, rarely remains contained. It leaves a stain, a lingering poison, and he feared the consequences would be far greater than his victorious nephews could possibly imagine. His fears were soon to be realized. Hundreds of miles to the east, in the fertile plains of Sumer, life continued in its ancient, ordered rhythm. In the great city of Ur, the capital of the flourishing Sumerian Empire, merchants guided their barges along the canals, scribes tallied the accounts of the temple storehouses, and the king consulted his priests, all under the watchful gaze of the moon god Nana, their divine patron. But then, a strange and ominous portent appeared in the sky. A dark, brooding cloud began to gather on the western horizon, drifting slowly, inexorably toward them. It did not look like a rain cloud, nor a common dust storm from the desert. It was a murky, brownish-black shroud that seemed to swallow the light, and it moved with an unnatural, silent purpose. This was the airborne funeral pyre of Sodom and Gomorrah, the vast, invisible cloud of radioactive particles from the nuclear blasts, carried eastward on the prevailing winds. The Sumerian poets who survived the horror would later give it a name. They would call it the evil wind. So, the wind did not arrive with a gale's fury, but with a stealthy, insidious quiet. It descended upon the cities of Sumer like a ghostly fog, carrying a fine, gray, gritty dust that settled into every crevice, coating the leaves of the date palms, the wool of the sheep, and the skin of the people with its impalpable filth. The air, once filled with the familiar smells of river water and hearth smoke, took on a strange, bitter, metallic taste. A great and unnatural silence seemed to fall over the land, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The people looked at the sky in confusion and fear, but their priests had no explanation, and their gods, for the first time, were silent. They did not yet understand that the danger was not in the cloud itself, but in the invisible demons it carried, the slow, creeping death of the poisoned atom. The aftermath was a slow, agonizing slide into oblivion. The first to suffer were the people. A strange and terrible sickness began to spread through the cities, a plague that defied every incantation of the healers. People grew weak and listless, their bodies racked with a fever that would not break. Their hair fell out in clumps, and their mouths and throats became covered in unhealing sores. The invisible poison attacked the very essence of life, unraveling their bodies from the inside out. Then the land itself began to die. The vibrant, life-giving waters of the Euphrates, now contaminated with the deadly dust, became a vector of death. The lush green fields of barley and wheat that were the pride of Sumer withered and turned black. The cattle in the pasture staggered and fell, their bellies bloated. The very soil was cursed. The great cities of Sumer, the world's first and brightest beacons of civilization, began to transform into vast, silent tombs. The great Sumerian poem, The Lament for written by a survivor, captures the desolation with heartbreaking clarity. On that day, the storm was joined by a scorching heat. In its streets where the feasting crowds had milled, scattered potsherds lay. The people, terrified, could hardly breathe. The evil wind clutched them, does not grant them another day. Its weak and its strong perished with hunger. The Anunnaki, watching the catastrophe unfold from their temples and their skyships, were horrified. This was not supposed to happen. Their surgical strike had turned into an indiscriminate continental disaster. They had won the battle against Marduk, but in doing so, they had inadvertently poisoned their own most beloved creation, their loyal heartland of Sumer. Their protective technologies could shield them from the worst of the fallout, but they knew the land was now uninhabitable for generations. One by one, in a state of shock and grief, the great gods abandoned their dying cities. Nana and his spouse fled their temple in The great Enlil himself was forced to abandon his sacred city of Nippur, the very center of his authority on Earth. They retreated to the safety of their orbiting vessel or to their less affected territories, leaving their dying human subjects to face the invisible, incomprehensible plague alone. The golden age of Sumer, the cradle of civilization, did not end with the glorious clash of invading armies. It ended with a quiet, agonizing whimper, suffocated by the lingering, deadly breath of a war that had not even been its own. The evil wind, having done its silent, murderous work, eventually dissipated. But the world it left behind was irrevocably broken. A profound and deathly silence fell over the plains of Sumer. The great cities, which had once been the vibrant, noisy hearts of civilization, were now little more than sprawling necropolises, their grand ziggurats standing as lonely tombstones over a poisoned land. The few survivors, gaunt and grief-stricken, wandered through empty streets, their spirits as barren as the blighted fields around them. But the most terrifying silence was the one that emanated from the heavens. The gods were gone. In the face of a calamity of their own making, the great Anunnaki patrons of Sumer, Enlil, Nana, Ninurta, had fled, abandoning their temples, their cities, and their people. For the first time since the dawn of their consciousness, humanity was utterly, and terrifyingly alone, left to choke on the dust of a golden age that had been brought to a sudden, inexplicable, and agonizing end. This was the great power vacuum, a void of leadership and hope in the heart of the civilized world. But the evil wind, for all its destructive breath, had not been universal. Due to the vagaries of celestial mechanics and prevailing winds, the radioactive cloud that had drifted eastward from the Sinai had largely bypassed the lands to the north along the upper Euphrates. The city of Babylon, Marduk's chosen seat, had been spared. While the holy cities of Enlil's domain were dying, Babylon remained untouched, a small island of life in a sea of desolation. For Marduk, watching the catastrophe unfold from afar, this was not a matter of meteorological luck. It was destiny. It was the ultimate vindication of his cause. When the dust finally settled, he returned to his city, not as a defeated exile, but as a triumphant savior. He presented the miracle of Babylon's survival to the terrified refugees who began to trickle in from the blighted south as a clear and simple sign. The great gods of Sumer, the Enlilites, had proven powerless to protect their own people from a calamity they themselves had caused. He, Marduk, had protected his followers. He was the only god worthy of their worship, the only leader who could restore order to a shattered world. He opened the granaries of Babylon, which he had wisely kept well stocked, and offered food and clean water to the starving survivors. He offered them shelter, purpose, and most of all, he offered them an explanation for the senseless horror they had endured. It was, he explained, a cosmic war, a final, necessary cleansing before a new and better age could begin, an age under his sole authority. And so, in the ashes of Sumer, the age of Marduk began. His first and most brilliant act was not one of conquest with arms, but with words. He understood that to rule the future, he must first rewrite the past. He gathered the scribes and priests of Babylon and dictated to them a new and glorious history of the universe, an epic poem that would supplant all the old Sumerian tales. This was the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian epic of creation. It was a masterful piece of political and religious propaganda. In his version of events, the great god Enlil was demoted to a minor supporting role. Even the supreme king of Nibiru, Anu himself, was rendered secondary. The hero of the cosmic story, the one who had brought order to the chaos of the early solar system by battling the primeval monster Tiamat, was Marduk. The epic established his preeminence not as a matter of political inheritance, but as a fundamental cosmological fact. He had not seized power. He had earned it at the dawn of time. By defeating Tiamat, he had been granted the Tablet of Destinies by the grateful Council of Gods, making him the supreme and eternal ruler of both heaven and earth. With this new state-sanctioned theology, he erased the contributions of his rivals and elevated himself to the status of a monotheistic deity, with all the other gods reduced to mere aspects or servants of his own divine will. With his divine authority now codified, he set about rebuilding Babylon on a scale of magnificence the world had never seen, ensuring that the physical city would be a worthy reflection of his newfound supremacy. He ordered the reconstruction of the Anunnaki, the great ziggurat that Enlil had destroyed, but this time it was completed without challenge, its shining top a beacon of his power. The city itself was expanded, surrounded by immense, impregnable walls, and graced with majestic, processional ways and hanging gardens that would become one of the wonders of the ancient world. Babylon became the new center of the earth, the true gateway of the gods, a cosmopolitan hub of trade, science, and culture that drew people from all the scattered, broken lands. The old Sumerian language, the tongue of the defeated gods, was replaced in official use by the Akkadian dialect of Babylon. The old ways were buried, and a new, centralized, and powerful world order was born. The remaining Anunnaki could do nothing to stop his inexorable rise. The Enlilites were a spent force, their cities poisoned, their followers dead or dispersed, their own hands stained with the sin of the evil wind. Enki, his father, weary of the endless conflict and perhaps holding a secret paternal pride in his son's audacious triumph, did not stand in his way. Marduk had finally achieved everything he had ever craved. He was the undisputed master of Earth, the king of the gods, his city the center of the universe. He had won the long war, not with a great battle, but with patience, with cunning, and by stepping boldly into the silent, poisoned void his enemies had created. The reign of Marduk from his magnificent capital of Babylon ushered in a new and final chapter in the direct governance of Earth by the Anunnaki. For centuries, civilization flourished under his singular, centralized authority. Great human kings, the most famous of whom would be Hammurabi, ruled in his name, their famous law codes presented as transcriptions of the supreme god's own divine will. Under this new order, the old rivalries of the gods seemed to fade into irrelevance. The Enlilites, their power base in Sumer shattered, and their loyal followers decimated by the evil wind, were a spent force. Enlil himself, the great commander, retreated from the affairs of Earth, becoming a distant, brooding figure. His ambitious granddaughter, Inanna, found her schemes and conquests checked by Marduk's supreme authority. She remained a powerful regional deity, but her dreams of ruling the world were over. And Enki, Marduk's father, accepted his son's ascendancy with a quiet philosophical grace, content to act as an elder statesman and a keeper of ancient wisdom, while the real power now rested securely in his son's hands. For a time, it seemed that Marduk's ambition had finally brought a lasting, if autocratic, peace to the world. But even as Babylon reached the zenith of its power and glory, a slow, imperceptible change was taking place, a quiet, celestial tide that was beginning to turn. The original, desperate purpose of the entire Earth mission, the great undertaking that had begun in a time before human memory, was nearing its completion. For millennia, through strife and peace, through creation and destruction, a steady stream of precious, life-giving gold had been shipped from Earth to the orbiting mothership, and from there on the long voyage home. On Nibiru, the Anunnaki scientists had been painstakingly grinding the metal into the finest monatomic dust and spraying it into their upper atmosphere. And it was working. The planet's thinning atmospheric shield was stabilizing. The slow, cold death of their world had been arrested. The mission was, for all intents and purposes, a success. The existential crisis that had driven them across the solar system was over. With this success, the fundamental reason for their continued large-scale presence on Earth began to evaporate. For the hundreds of rank-and-file Anunnaki, the Igigi who had once toiled in the mines and the technicians who had maintained the cities, a deep, collective homesickness began to set in. Earth was no longer a vital strategic outpost. It was a complex, messy, and increasingly self-sufficient colony whose primary purpose had been fulfilled. They simply wanted to go home. The departure was not a sudden, singular event, not a great exodus of celestial chariots filling the sky. It was a gradual withdrawal, a slow, centuries-long fading of the divine presence. It was a tide going out so slowly that those living on the shore barely noticed the water level dropping until one day they looked up and realized the ocean had receded to a distant horizon. At first, the gods simply became less visible. Their physical appearances in the courts of human kings, once a regular occurrence, became rare and momentous events, and then they ceased altogether. The kings who followed were now appointed through complex priestly rituals and omens, their divine mandate a matter of tradition rather than a direct, personal encounter. The gods still spoke, but now only through their chosen high priests, their commands delivered in dreams or whispered prophecies from behind the veil of the temple's innermost sanctum. Then even these messages grew infrequent, their meaning more obscure. The great temples in Babylon, Thebes, and Uruk, which had been built as the literal physical homes for the gods, slowly transformed. They became symbolic palaces, grand houses maintained by an ever-growing class of human priests who performed elaborate rituals, not for a present deity, but based on the detailed, inherited memory of one. The gods were slowly, gracefully transforming from beings of flesh and blood into beings of faith and story. Humanity, the child, was being weaned from its divine parentage, prepared for an age when it would have to stand on its own. One by one, the great figures of the Anunnaki pantheon took their final leave. Enlil, the commander whose authoritarian rule had shaped the earth for so long, his work now done and his power eclipsed by Marduk, was one of the first of the leaders to make the final journey home to Nibiru. His formidable son, Ninurta, and the grieving mother goddess Ninmah eventually followed. Inanna, her ambitions on Earth now thwarted, left to seek new adventures in other star systems. Enki, the great scientist, the creator, lingered the longest. He felt the deepest bond to the flawed, beautiful creatures he had fashioned, and he stayed for a time as a quiet, unseen guardian, a final, watchful presence, ensuring his children were ready for their independence. Eventually, even he departed, his final legacy the encoded secrets of science and genetics that he left behind with a select few priestly orders. And finally, Marduk himself, the supreme ruler of Earth, prepared for his own departure. Having achieved his every ambition, perhaps he grew weary of his terrestrial kingdom, or perhaps he was summoned back to Nibiru to account for his actions and take his place in the home world's politics. He left his great city and his system of laws as his enduring monument, and he too promised his wailing followers that one day he would return. The great spaceport in the Sinai was ceremonially decommissioned, its vast runways and underground facilities buried beneath the shifting sands. Its purpose served. The age of the gods, the era of direct physical contact between heaven and earth, had finally, quietly come to an end. Humanity was now alone, left with only the towering, enigmatic stone structures, the half-forgotten stories, and the lingering, instinctive memory of the giants who had once walked among them. A great and profound silence descended upon the earth. In the centuries following the final departure of the Anunnaki, the direct, thundering voice of the divine, which had guided, commanded, and terrified humanity for millennia, was gone. In its place was a quiet echo, a lingering memory that was at once a comfort and a source of deep, abiding mystery. Humanity, now entering its adolescence as a species, was left alone in its planetary home, with only the stories and the strange, colossal monuments of its departed parents to contemplate. The central questions that would come to define the human spirit were born in this silence. Where did the great gods go? And will they, as they promised, one day return? In the absence of answers, humanity did what it has always done. It began to remember. And those memories, passed down through generations, polished by poets and codified by priests, slowly transformed from history into myth, from fact into faith. The Anunnaki were no longer physical beings who could be seen and spoken to. They became the archetypes and divine forces that would populate the heavens of 1,000 different cultures. Their legacy was first and most powerfully encoded in the world's religions. As humanity scattered from the shattered unity of Babylon, their languages and cultures diverged, and the names and attributes of their former masters changed with them, like a story whispered from one person to the next, becoming distorted and embellished with each retelling. The core personalities, however, remained strangely intact. The great and terrible Enlil, the stern commander of the heavens, whose word was law and whose wrath was the flood, was remembered as the archetype of the Sky Father. He became Zeus to the Greeks, brandishing his thunderbolt like a divine energy weapon. He was Jupiter to the Romans, the supreme and often unforgiving king of the gods. His brother, the wise Enki, creator of man and master of the waters and of secret knowledge, was fragmented into other figures. He was Poseidon, the lord of the sea. He was Prometheus, the trickster god who defied the ruling power to give the forbidden gift of knowledge to mankind. The dazzling, ambitious, and often dangerous Inanna, goddess of love and war, was reborn as the beautiful Aphrodite and the fierce Athena, her contradictory passions divided into separate, more manageable deities. And the story of Marduk, the rebel son who had overthrown the old order, who had died and been resurrected in some versions of his myth, and who had ascended to become the supreme king of heaven with the promise of a future return, became the most powerful and enduring archetype of all, a template for the savior gods of countless future faiths. The great events of the Anunnaki saga, the creation of man from clay and divine essence, the great world-destroying flood survived by a single chosen family, the bitter wars between the gods that shook the heavens, became the foundational myths of nearly every civilization on the planet, a shared collective memory that hinted at a single, forgotten source. The second great echo of their presence was written not in words, but in stone. All across the globe, humanity was left with colossal, enigmatic structures that seemed to defy the logic of the primitive ages that followed. The Great Pyramids at Giza, their original purpose as celestial beacons for the Sinai spaceport now forgotten, were reinterpreted as the tombs of human kings, their impossible mathematical precision and astronomical alignments a mystery that baffled the generations who came after. In the mountains of Lebanon, the foundation of a great temple at a place called Baalbek rested on a podium of stone blocks, some weighing over 1,000 tons, cut and placed with a precision that modern machinery would struggle to replicate. In the high Andes of South America, the ruins of Pumapunku lay scattered like a child's discarded toys, its intricate stone blocks cut with laser-like edges and complex interlocking joints that seemed more machine-made than hand-carved. These and 100 other megalithic sites stood as a silent, global testament to a lost age of impossible technology. Later civilizations, having lost the knowledge of their true origin, could only look upon these works with awe and attribute them to the power of giants, magicians, or the gods themselves, never suspecting that they were simply the leftover construction projects of their former masters. And finally, their legacy whispered from the cryptic verses of ancient texts, the memories of their technology preserved in the language of miracle and magic. The devastating power of the 7 weapons of terror that had laid waste to the cities of the plain was no longer understood as nuclear fission, but was remembered as a rain of divine fire and brimstone. The sleek, silent skyships of the Anunnaki were forgotten as physical craft, and were transformed into the fiery chariots that carried prophets like Elijah into the heavens, or the fabulous jewel-encrusted vimanas described in the Hindu Vedas, flying palaces that waged complex aerial battles in the sky. The genetic engineering in the House of Life became a story of a god breathing life into a figure of clay. The Anunnaki themselves, once tangible rulers and commanders, became the angels of the Bible, divine messengers who looked like men, who ate and drank with mortals, and who sometimes delivered tidings of great joy and at other times stark warnings of terrible, impending doom. The entire sprawling and unbelievable history of the Anunnaki on Earth was not lost. It was simply hidden in plain sight, fragmented and encoded within the sacred myths, the impossible stone ruins, and the holy books of the very creatures they had created and abandoned. The past was not dead. It was merely sleeping, waiting for a future generation of humanity, a generation that had rediscovered the principles of genetics, the power of the atom, and the ability to reach beyond their own atmosphere, to finally recognize the faces of their long-departed creators in the mirror of their own achievements. The departure of the Anunnaki left a God-shaped void in the human psyche, and for millennia, humanity filled that void with the echoes of their memory. The stories of their creators were woven into the rich tapestries of myth and religion. Their colossal structures were pondered by philosophers, and their laws became the bedrock of fledgling empires. But as humanity grew and its own civilizations rose and fell, the age of Babylon giving way to Persia, then to the logical precision of Greece and the unstoppable might of Rome, a new way of understanding the universe began to emerge. The heavens, once seen as a celestial canvas for divine drama, were slowly reinterpreted as a great, intricate machine, a clockwork of predictable orbits and physical laws. Science was born, and in its bright empirical light, the old myths were dismissed as the fanciful superstitions of a primitive, unenlightened age. The stories of gods who descended from the sky in fiery chariots were filed away as poetry, not history. Humanity, proud of its newfound reason, believed it had finally put away its childish things. And yet, the legacy remained. The massive stones of Baalbek still defied explanation. The sudden flowering of civilization in ancient Sumer remained an academic puzzle. The great global myth of a devastating flood persisted across cultures separated by vast oceans, and the ancient clay tablets of Mesopotamia, when finally deciphered, spoke not of allegorical fables, but of concrete events, precise genealogies, and detailed astronomical knowledge that seemed impossible for people who had only the naked eye to study the heavens. The story of the Anunnaki, whether taken as literal history or powerful metaphor, remains one of humanity's most profound and enduring narratives. It is a story that speaks to our deepest questions. Where do we come from? What is our purpose? Are we alone in the universe? And what is the nature of the divine spark we feel within us? Perhaps the Anunnaki were real, physical beings from a distant world who came to Earth in desperation and in the process of saving themselves, created us. Perhaps they were the first teachers of a primitive species, the architects who lifted us from the animal kingdom and set us on the path to civilization. Or perhaps they are something else entirely, a collective memory, a symbolic representation of the forces that shaped our evolution, the personification of the complex, often contradictory nature of human consciousness itself. What is undeniable is that their story, preserved in the oldest written records of our species, encoded in monuments that still stand after millennia, and echoed in the religious traditions of billions, continues to resonate with a strange and powerful truth. The gods may have departed, ascending to the stars from which they came, leaving humanity to chart its own course through the cosmos. But their legacy remains, written in stone, whispered in ancient prayers, and carried in the very DNA of a species that still looks to the heavens and wonders. The great silence that followed their departure is not empty. It is full of questions, full of mysteries, and full of the promise that one day, perhaps, we will understand the full truth of our origins. Until then, we are left with the stories, the entire, sprawling, magnificent, and terrifying saga of the Anunnaki gods, told as it was written on clay tablets 6,000 years ago, when the memory was still fresh and the gods had only just said their final farewell. The story is complete. The gods have departed, and humanity, for better or worse, has been left to inherit the earth and forge its own destiny among the stars. If you are still here and this story has touched you, please support us with a like or subscribe if it's your first time watching the channel. Share with us the mysteries you would like us to explore next. Until next time, sweet dreams and keep questioning.